My 14-year-old daughter was still barely responsive when my mother looked past the hospital curtain and asked, "Did Simone's team still win?" Dad rubbed both hands over his face and muttered, "She needed this." I thought he meant Leah, until my phone buzzed. The meet's athletic trainer had sent me a form signed nearly 2 hours before my daughter collapsed. Across the top, in red, were 4 words: "Not cleared to compete." Beneath them was my sister's signature. Mom saw what I was dialing and whispered, "Kate, please don't." I called the police anyway. Before I tell you how my sister's signature ended up on that form, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me to the end, because what I learned about my daughter and about myself changed far more than our family. And if stories like this mean something to you, you're always welcome to subscribe and stay with us. To understand why I trusted Simone that morning, you have to understand that, until the 18th of April 2026, I had never thought of my sister as someone Leah needed protecting from. That Saturday began with bobby pins. I had packed 12 of them, even though Leah needed 6. Then I added another card. Because one of the first lessons competitive gymnastics had taught me, long before I became a mother, was that the tiny thing you forgot would somehow become the only thing anybody needed once you were 40 minutes from home. By 6:30 that morning, the kitchen island held Leah's meat bag, her warm-up jacket, 2 water bottles, electrolyte packets, athletic tape, a banana she would probably refuse to eat, a backup snack she would definitely eat, and enough emergency hair supplies to secure the heads of an entire gymnastics team. Leah came into the kitchen already wearing her competition leotard under loose warm-up pants. She had one eye half closed, and her hair gathered in the kind of unfinished bun that made it look as though she had been interrupted halfway through an argument with gravity. She watched me slide another bobby pin into the front pocket of her bag. "Mom, one more pin, and TSA is going to classify my head as luggage." The pin stayed between my fingers for a second before I started laughing. Leah's mouth lifted on one side, satisfied that she had managed to stop me without technically asking me to stop. That was her humor, dry, efficient, usually delivered with the same serious face she wore before a difficult routine. I put the pin back in the kitchen drawer. What I did not put away was the habit behind it. I planned for things. It was what I did at work, what I did at home, and what I had always done when I was frightened of leaving a gap large enough for trouble to crawl through. My job involved coordinating schedules and service disruptions for a regional transit agency. I spent weekdays thinking about what happened when one bus arrived 9 minutes late and displaced 3 other decisions farther down the line. Somewhere along the way, that way of thinking had followed me home. I kept spare chargers in my car, pain reliever in my desk, copies of Leah's school forms in a folder, and snacks in places where snacks had no logical reason to exist. Usually Leah found it funny. That morning, though, after the joke passed, she stood at the counter looking down at the banana without touching it. I noticed because Leah ate before meets whether she wanted to or not. Simone had taught her years earlier that nerves were not an excuse for starting a competition underfueled, and Leah treated that rule with the same seriousness she treated grips and landing drills. I asked if her stomach was bothering her. She said it wasn't. Then, she rubbed her thumb over a faint chalk stain that had somehow survived the shower from the night before and said she was just tired. There are different kinds of tired in a 14-year-old. There is the dramatic exhaustion caused by being asked to empty a dishwasher. There is the real exhaustion of school, training, growth, hormones, homework, friendships, and a body that seems to need more sleep every month. And then there is another kind, the quiet one parents sometimes mistake for moodiness, because the child does not yet have the language to explain what is wearing them down. I heard the first 2. I missed the third. Leah said it felt as if every conversation lately ended at another meet. This weekend's scores, next month's invitational, summer training, whether she would move up, whether the team would qualify strongly enough for the next level of competition. She did not say she wanted to quit. She did not ask me to withdraw her. She simply stared at the countertop and wondered aloud what it would feel like not to know where she would be every Saturday for the next 3 months. I answered the way I thought a responsible mother should. I reminded her that the season was already underway and that she had made a commitment to her team. I told her we could have a real conversation about next year, when the season ended, when she was rested and not staring down a competition day. In my mind, I was giving her permission to reconsider without allowing one difficult morning to become a permanent decision. I thought I was teaching her not to confuse exhaustion with certainty. She nodded and finally picked up the banana. At the time, that felt like resolution. Later, I would remember the way she had looked at it before she took the first bite. Pacific Crest had been part of our family for almost 8 years by then, though Simone's relationship with gymnastics had begun decades earlier. She was nearly 3 years older than I was, which in childhood had been enough to make her seem like an authority on everything from hairstyles to friendships, to whether landing on the balls of your feet was a life skill. We had both started gymnastics young. Simone had stayed. I had not. At 15, I finally admitted that I hated the pressure more than I loved the sport. I still loved the sensation of movement, the strange quiet that came before a difficult skill, the satisfaction of doing something on Tuesday that had terrified me on Monday. But competition had begun to hollow those things out. Every good routine immediately became preparation for a better one. Every mistake followed me home. Every family meal after a meet somehow became an unofficial review. When I told my parents I wanted to stop, nobody screamed at me. Nobody threatened me. That would have been easier to identify. Mom talked about the years already invested, the early mornings, the fees, the drives, the things I might regret leaving unfinished. Dad said very little. Simone kept training. For years afterward, family stories developed their own shorthand. Simone was the one who stuck with things. I was the one who knew when I had had enough. Nobody called me weak. Nobody had to. Admiration can teach a child almost as efficiently as punishment. By adulthood, I thought I had made peace with that distinction. I had a career I liked, a daughter I adored, and no desire to prove that leaving gymnastics at 15 had been the correct decision. When Leah fell in love with the sport, I told myself her experience would be different because I would never make winning a condition of my approval. And Simone, to be fair, had given me years of reasons to believe that. She had taught Leah her first clean cartwheel on the strip of grass behind our parents' house when Leah was 6. She had stayed late at Pacific Crest when Leah was 9 because fear had suddenly appeared in a skill she had been doing for months. Simone did not shame her that day. She broke the movement down until it became small enough for Leah to trust again. 2 years later, after Leah had one of the worst meets of her life, Simone sat beside her on a bench outside the venue and talked about everything except the score. I could not hear the whole conversation from where I stood, but I saw Leah's shoulders gradually come down from around her ears. 20 minutes later, she was laughing. Those memories mattered. They were why? When we reached the invitational that April morning, and Simone took one look at Leah rubbing the side of her thumb against her index finger, I relaxed before Leah did. That little repetitive motion was one of Leah's nervous habits. Simone knew it. She stepped close enough to say something I could not hear over the whistles, music, announcements, and hundreds of voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Whatever she said worked. Leah breathed out, rolled her shoulders once, and gave Simone a small smile. I remember thinking how lucky I was that my daughter had an aunt who understood a part of her life I no longer fully belonged to. My parents arrived 20 minutes later. Mom carried the exact brand of peanut butter crackers Leah liked between rotations and, predictably, another packet of hair ties. Dad took one look at the meat bag hanging from my shoulder and teased me about packing for a natural disaster instead of a 4-hour competition. Leah grinned because someone other than her had noticed. For a while, everything felt ordinary. Mom talked about Simone's season in the way she always did, with numbers tucked inside concern. Pacific Crest had struggled at 2 meets earlier that year. A few families had moved gyms. Simone had rebuilt lineups twice. Mom knew which teams were strongest, which scores would matter most, and approximately where Pacific Crest needed to finish to make the weekend feel like a success. None of that sounded sinister. Youth sports parents and grandparents talk about standings. Coaches care about results. Athletes keep track of scores. I understood the language because I had grown up inside it. What I did not notice was how often Leah's name appeared in the same sentences as what the team needed. The warm-up area was separated from the parent seating by railings, staff credentials, and a strip of floor that might as well have been a moat. Parents were used to it. Once athletes entered the competition area, coaches and officials handled them. We watched from the other side and trusted the people wearing the appropriate badges. Leah was on beam warm-up when I saw her foot miss. It was not the kind of fall that makes an entire gym go silent. Gymnasts fall. Mats exist because they fall. From the stands, I saw her come off awkwardly and hit the padded surface hard enough that my body reacted before my mind did. My hand closed around the strap of my bag. Leah rolled to one side, then pushed herself upright. The people around me kept talking. I stood. She stayed sitting longer than I expected. Simone reached her first. Another woman in medical clothing came over from the side of the warm-up area, Dana Ruiz. Though at that point, I knew her only as one of the athletic trainers working the meet. Leah was guided away from the apparatus. I started toward the access point. An event volunteer stopped me before I reached the barrier and explained that parents could not enter the warm-up area unless medical staff requested them. It was a rule I already knew, which somehow made being reminded of it more irritating. I could see my daughter 20 yards away. That did not mean I was allowed to cross 20 yards of competition floor. Simone looked up while Dana was speaking to Leah. Our eyes met. Simone lifted one hand in a small gesture that told me she had it handled. That gesture bought my trust. Not because I did not care enough to push past the volunteer, because Simone was Leah's aunt, because Simone had coached her for years, because there was a medical professional standing beside them, because competent adults were doing exactly what competent adults were supposed to do around an athlete who had taken a bad fall. From where I stood, Dana appeared to ask Leah questions and have her follow something with her eyes. Leah sat on a folding chair. Simone listened. I could not hear a word. Mom came up beside me and said Leah looked all right from where she was standing. I did not answer. My eyes stayed on Leah. Eventually, Simone moved away. Dana stayed with Leah a little longer. Leah did not return to beam warm-up. That should have been enough to make me insist on an explanation. I know that now. But hindsight gives every moment clean edges it did not have when you were living through it. At the time, I saw a child who had fallen, a trainer who had evaluated her, a coach who knew I was watching, and a system built around athlete safety. Nobody waved me over. Nobody told me Leah had suffered a head injury. Nobody told me she had been removed from competition. So when another rotation began, and I saw Leah standing with her teammates again, I did what most parents would probably have done. I assumed the people responsible for making that decision had made it. She had her warm-up jacket off. Her hair was still tight. Simone stood near the team. Officials continued moving athletes through their rotations. Nothing in the room looked like an emergency. Relief is dangerous when it arrives carrying the answer you want. Mom touched my forearm and made a small comment about Leah being tougher than she looked. I barely registered it. I was watching my daughter, trying to decide whether her face looked pale or whether the overhead lights were making everyone look pale. Leah caught me looking. She lifted her hand. I lifted mine back. That tiny wave has bothered me more than some of the bigger moments that came later, because she knew I was there, and I thought that meant she knew I would protect her. By the time Pacific Crest reached floor exercise, the noise inside the venue had thickened into one continuous layer: music from one corner, applause from another, coaches calling names, the dull spring of bodies landing on mats, announcers trying to compete with all of it. Leah had always liked floor more than beam. She liked that there was room to move. Even as a little girl, she had been happier crossing an open floor than balancing above it. I watched her step into position. She looked serious, but serious was normal. The music began. For the first few seconds, I saw the daughter I knew. Muscle memory carried her through the opening sequence. Her arms found their marks. Her feet seemed to know where the floor would be before they touched it. Then something changed. It was so small I could not have named it in real time. A hesitation where there normally was none. A fraction of a second when her body seemed to be waiting for information that had not arrived. She accelerated into a tumbling pass. My stomach tightened. Leah left the floor. Her rotation was wrong before she came down. Instead of completing the movement cleanly, she under-rotated and hit the mat at an angle that collapsed her legs beneath her. Momentum carried her sideways. Her shoulder struck first, then the side of her head. This time, she did not immediately move. The music stopped. There are moments when a room full of hundreds of people becomes silent only in your memory. I am sure someone was still shouting. I am sure another event continued somewhere across the gym. I remember none of it. I remember dropping my bag. I remember one of the water bottles rolling under a row of seats. I remember the rail biting into my palm when I reached the barrier. Then people were running toward Leah. Dana appeared almost immediately. Simone was already on her knees near the edge of the mat, but someone moved her back to give the medical staff space. Her face had gone white. That was the first moment. Fear stopped being an idea and became physical inside me. My hands would not stay still. Staff opened the access point for me. By the time I reached the floor, Dana and another responder were working over Leah. I was kept close enough to see her face and far enough not to interfere. Her eyes were closed. Someone called for emergency medical services. I heard the words loss of consciousness somewhere near me. After that, the next several minutes came apart into pieces. A hand at my elbow. A question about allergies. Someone asking Leah's date of birth. The scrape of equipment being moved across the floor. Simone standing several feet away with one hand over her mouth. Mom and Dad trapped behind the barrier because there was no reason for 3 more family members to crowd the medical team. The stupid banana from that morning still inside Leah's bag. I had spent half my life preparing for small emergencies. There was nothing in my bag for this one. Paramedics arrived. Leah showed enough response to keep everyone moving with controlled urgency rather than panic, but she was not awake in any way that felt like my daughter. Her eyelids fluttered once when someone spoke loudly near her. Her hand moved. Then she disappeared again behind procedure, straps, questions, and the practiced motions of people who knew what to do when I did not. I answered what they asked me. That was the only useful thing I could do. The ambulance doors were almost ready to close when Dana caught up with me near the edge of the loading area. Sweat had darkened the hair around her temples. She looked past me once toward the venue, before focusing on my face. Her question sounded strange enough that I thought I had misunderstood it. She wanted to know who had cleared Leah to return to competition. For a second, I could only stare at her. I told her I had assumed she had. Dana's face changed, not dramatically. She did not gasp or curse. Her mouth simply stopped moving, and every trace of professional reassurance disappeared from her expression. Then she said 4 words. I didn't clear her. The paramedic called for me. I climbed into the ambulance with my daughter, and the doors closed before I could ask Dana anything else. But all the way to the hospital, one thought sat beside me louder than the siren. If the medical professional had not cleared Leah, then someone had put my daughter back onto that floor anyway. The ambulance ride lasted less than half an hour, but the distance between the competition floor and the emergency department felt longer than anything I had traveled in years. I sat strapped beside Leah's stretcher, with both hands clenched around the edge of the seat, watching strangers do the things I had spent 14 years, assuming I would always be the person to do for her. They checked her pupils, repeated her name, ask simple questions when she stirred, then recorded the moments when she did not answer clearly enough. Every few minutes, one of them glanced at a monitor or spoke into the radio in the calm, clipped language of people who knew panic had no useful place in the job. Leah's face looked wrong without expression. Chalk still clung to the skin near one wrist. One bobby pin had worked loose from her hair and rested against the collar of her warm-up jacket. I stared at it for so long that the object stopped looking like something ordinary and became evidence of how recently my life had still been normal. Less than 3 hours earlier, she had complained that I was turning her head into airport luggage. Now I would have given anything to hear her complain about me again. She became intermittently responsive before we reached the hospital. Once, when a paramedic asked her name loudly, her mouth moved and the right answer came out too softly for me to hear. Another time she opened her eyes, but could not keep them focused. That should have comforted me. Instead, the inconsistency frightened me more. A child who looks completely unconscious gives you one kind of terror. A child who surfaces and disappears again gives you another, because every return makes you wonder whether the next one will last. At the emergency department, the world became fluorescent light, rolling wheels, clipped questions, and doors that opened only for the people wearing the right badges. I repeated Leah's birthday, allergies, medication history, and the sequence I had seen at the meet. I described the first fall as best I could, though I had watched it from the parent side of the barrier. I told them she had later returned to floor and collapsed after an under-rotated tumbling pass. I told them what Dana had said before the ambulance left. I did not say the sentence that had formed in my head. Someone had sent her back. I did not know that yet. I knew only that Dana had not cleared her. The distinction mattered, even while every part of me wanted a name to attach to what had happened. The emergency physician ordered the kind of evaluation that made time disappear into waiting. Leah was taken for imaging. I signed what I needed to sign and answered whatever was put in front of me. The CT showed no skull fracture and no intracranial bleed, which the doctor framed as reassuring without pretending it meant she was fine. The concern remained a concussion, complicated by a second impact and loss of consciousness. They wanted neurological observation overnight because her responsiveness had been inconsistent and because the second fall had occurred after symptoms were already possible from the first. Most of that information came to me in compressed pieces. I remember the doctor's mouth moving. I remember nodding. I remember storing the phrases I would need later and losing all the ones I did not. No bleed, no fracture. Observation, concussion, second impact. Evan called while Leah was still being moved between departments. We had not been together in years, but shared legal custody meant he needed to know, and being Leah's father meant he would have wanted to know even if paperwork had said otherwise. I gave him the shortest version I could manage. He was in Orange County and said he was leaving immediately. I told him there was nothing useful he could do from the freeway, except drive safely. The fact that I sounded practical almost fooled me into believing I was functioning normally. I wasn't. My hands had started shaking somewhere between radiology and the observation room. I hid them under my thighs when a nurse came in. By the time my parents arrived, Leah was still not fully awake. She responded when the nurse pressed her shoulder and sometimes opened her eyes when her name was repeated, but she drifted again before anything resembling a conversation could begin. The room was dimmer than the main emergency department. A monitor pulsed quietly beside the bed. Someone had placed Leah's meat bag on a chair near the wall. The zipper was half open, and the banana from that morning was still inside. Mom entered first. She had removed the cardigan she had worn at the meet and folded it over one arm. Dad followed carrying 2 paper cups he had probably bought, because buying coffee was something people knew how to do when they did not know what else to do. He set one on the counter untouched. They both looked older than they had in the stands. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Mom went straight to Leah's bed and touched 2 fingers to her ankle because the nurse had told us not to crowd around her head. Dad stood near the wall with his shoulders slightly rounded, staring at the floor as if the answer to something might be written there. Then Mom looked at me. Did Simone's team still win? The question did not register at first. Not because I had misheard it. Because my mind refused to place those words inside that room. I looked at Leah. Her eyes were closed. The adhesive from one medical sensor pulled slightly at the skin near her collarbone when she breathed. Her competition makeup was still faintly visible around her lashes. The same child my mother had fed peanut butter crackers between rotations was lying under a hospital blanket after 2 head impacts and 1 terrifying loss of consciousness. And somehow the first question Mom had managed to form was about a team score. Dad rubbed both hands over his face. She needed this. For one strange second, I thought he meant Leah. That maybe he had decided my daughter needed some hard lesson about pressure or ambition, or listening to her body. The thought was so ugly that it made me look at him sharply. Then I understood from the way his eyes shifted toward Mom. He meant Simone. Simone had needed the win. The team had struggled all season. Parents had been questioning the program. Dad believed a strong result would have steadied her, given her breathing room, proven something after months of pressure. None of that required explanation because I already knew the season had been difficult. What stunned me was that the context had survived the ambulance ride intact inside their heads. I had forgotten the score existed. They had not. Mom must have seen something change in my face, because she tried to soften what she had asked. She said she only meant that the whole day had become a disaster, and she was trying to understand how far it had spread. Dad added that nobody was saying the team mattered more than Leah. Their explanations arrived too late. The question had already shown me the order in which their minds had reached for damage. Leah, Simone, the team, reputation. I could not yet tell where those things ranked for them. I only knew they had all made it into the same mental calculation. I stood and moved toward the window, because staying beside the bed suddenly felt dangerous. Anger was doing something hot and precise to the muscles in my jaw. Outside, the parking structure filled most of the view. Cars entered. Headlights swept across concrete. And people continued arriving for ordinary emergencies that had nothing to do with us. My phone buzzed against the windowsill. The message came from a number I did not recognize. For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then I saw the first line. My name. The sender identified herself as Dana Ruiz, the athletic trainer who had evaluated Leah at the meet. She said she had obtained my emergency contact information through the registration record because she had learned I had never been informed that Leah had been removed from competition. She apologized for contacting me while I was at the hospital, then said there was something I needed immediately. An attachment sat beneath the message. I opened it. The document was plain enough that my mind initially tried to treat it like every school form, insurance form, consent form, and activity waiver I had signed since Leah entered kindergarten. Venue logo. Athlete name. Date. Time. Symptoms. Evaluation notes. Coach acknowledgement. Then I saw the red text across the upper section. Not cleared to compete. My thumb stopped moving. I read it once. Then again. Leah Mercer. April 18, 2020, Shishase. The timestamp was nearly 2 hours before her collapse. The listed symptoms included headache, dizziness, visual difficulty, and trouble with tracking. The instruction beneath them stated that she was removed from athletic participation for the remainder of the day and required appropriate medical evaluation before return. Below that was an acknowledgement line for the responsible coach. Simone Mercer. My sister's signature. There are discoveries that arrive as explosions. This one arrived as stillness. The room did not change. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Dad's coffee still sat untouched. Mom was still standing near Leah's feet, but one sentence from the meet rearranged itself inside my memory. I didn't clear her. Until that moment, there had still been room for confusion. Maybe another medical professional had evaluated Leah. Maybe someone had misunderstood what Dana meant. Maybe there had been a communication failure so ordinary and stupid that no single person had knowingly made the decision. The signature took those possibilities away from me. Simone had received the restriction. She had acknowledged it. Leah had competed anyway. I zoomed in on the signature, even though I had known Simone's handwriting my entire life. The capital S leaned forward. The final letters tightened together, the way they always did when she signed quickly. Mom came closer before I realized she had moved. She read over my shoulder. Her hand tightened around the cardigan. Dad set down the coffee cup he had finally picked up. Nobody asked what the document was. They could see. I called the police. Not 911. Leah was already in the emergency department, surrounded by people doing exactly what emergency medicine required. What I needed now was to report that an adult responsible for my daughter had apparently known she was medically removed from a youth sporting event and returned her to competition anyway. Mom saw what I was dialing. "Kate, please don't." Her voice was low enough that it barely carried past the end of the bed. I looked at her. She began telling me to wait until Simone arrived. There had to be more context. Simone had coached for years. She would never deliberately hurt Leah. Dad joined in more carefully, asking me not to turn one terrible judgment into a criminal matter before we knew exactly what had happened. That phrasing stayed with me. One terrible judgment. They had already given the act a name before hearing Simone's explanation. Not a safety violation. Not knowingly returning an injured child. A judgment. Something professional. Debatable. The kind of thing adults disagreed about in offices. I turned away from them and made the report. The person on the other end did not react dramatically. I gave my name, Leah's age, the hospital location, the meet information, what I had witnessed, what Dana had told me, and what the form showed. I was told an officer would take preliminary information and that follow-up would likely be needed because the incident involved a minor, medical records, multiple adults, and an athletic event. There was no promise of arrest, no instant conclusion, just a record beginning where there had not been one before. That was enough. When the call ended, Mom looked at me as though I had set something irreversible in motion. Maybe I had, but the irreversible thing had happened before I touched my phone. It had happened when someone decided a red medical restriction could become optional because a child wanted to compete. Simone arrived nearly 40 minutes later. By then, Evan had reached the hospital and sat quietly on the far side of the room after checking with the nurse and making sure there were no decisions waiting on his consent. He knew my family well enough to recognize that something had broken open between us, but not enough to pretend he understood what. I showed him the form. He read it, looked at Leah, and asked no questions in front of my parents. Simone stopped just inside the room. Her face looked worse than it had beside the mat. She had changed out of her coaching jacket, but was still wearing the same black pants and athletic shoes from the meet. Her hair had loosened around her temples. There was a faint smear of chalk near one hip. She looked like someone who had spent the last hour replaying the same few minutes and failing to find a version that ended differently. I held up my phone. I did not ask whether the signature was hers. I asked why my daughter had competed after Simone signed a document saying she was not cleared. Simone did not deny it. That mattered. She did not claim Dana had made a mistake. She did not say someone forged her name. She did not ask to inspect the form. Instead, she explained, Leah had felt better after resting. She had wanted to compete. Dana was obligated to be conservative after any possible head injury. Simone had watched Leah for years and believed she knew when Leah was truly compromised and when she was frightened or shaken. By the time the rotation was moving, Leah had told her she could do it. The explanation came in pieces because I did not let the conversation become a debate. Most of what Simone said I remember now as meaning rather than exact wording. Only one question from me stayed sharp. Why didn't you call me? Simone looked toward Leah before answering. There had not been time, she said. The rotation was moving. Leah had already decided. That was the moment the shape of what she had done became clearer than the form itself. She had not just ignored a restriction. She had taken an adult responsibility and handed it to a 14-year-old. Leah had decided. As if a child standing inside the machinery of team expectations, coach authority, family loyalty, and a possible concussion carried the same decision-making burden as the adult whose signature sat beneath the warning. Mom moved towards Simone almost immediately. She did not excuse the choice outright, but she began gathering intent around it like padding. Simone had made the wrong call. Simone loved Leah. Simone had coached hundreds of safe routines. Simone had no reason to believe this would happen. Dad's version was quieter. He kept returning to the fact that no one had meant for Leah to be hurt. I listened until I could not. I told them the difference between intent and responsibility was not something I was willing to debate beside my unconscious daughter. Mom's mouth tightened. I asked both of them to leave if they were there to talk about what Simone might lose. For once, Dad did not argue. He touched Mom's elbow, and after a few seconds, she allowed him to guide her into the hallway. Simone stayed where she was, until I told her she needed to leave too. She looked at Leah for a long time before she went. I almost hated that. It would have been easier if she had looked cold. She didn't. She looked devastated. Love, I was beginning to understand, did not automatically make people safe. Leah woke properly near midnight. Not all at once. Her eyes opened and stayed open longer. She recognized me, then Evan. She struggled with the light, so the nurse dimmed the room further. Her voice came out rough and small, nothing like the dry teenager who had joked about airport security that morning. We did not explain everything. The doctor wanted her resting, not processing a family crisis. We told her she was in the hospital, that she had hit her head again, that the scans had not shown bleeding, and that she needed observation overnight. She listened with the concentration of someone trying to hold on to words that kept sliding away. Then she asked the question that made the entire day feel even uglier. Did we lose? I thought I had misheard her. She swallowed and asked if the team had lost because she had not finished. I moved closer to the bed and told her the score did not matter. Her eyes filled before she looked away. Was it because of me? That was when I stopped thinking of what happened as a single bad decision made by Simone. A child who had lost consciousness, been transported by ambulance, undergone brain imaging, and woken in a hospital bed, was measuring the disaster by whether she had cost other people points. Something had taught her to do that. I sat with the thought for several minutes before asking the question I had been carrying since the ambulance. I kept my voice quiet. I asked why she had gone back out after the trainer stopped her. Leah's fingers moved against the hospital blanket, worrying the edge of it between thumb and forefinger. She did not look at me. Aunt Simone said I could choose. Her eyes stayed on the blanket. Then, after a pause, she whispered the part I would hear again for years. I just didn't know I was allowed to choose no. For the first few days after Leah came home, the phrase followed me from room to room. I just didn't know I was allowed to choose no. It was there when I lowered the brightness on her phone and set it face down on the kitchen counter. It was there when I emailed her teachers about reduced assignments and shorter school days. It sat beside me at 2 a.m. when I woke, convinced I had heard her moving, and found only the refrigerator humming through the dark. The doctors had sent us home with instructions that sounded simple until we had to build an ordinary life around them. Rest, but not complete isolation. Limit screens if they worsened symptoms. Return to school gradually. Stop an activity if the headaches increased. Watch for changes that meant we should come back immediately. Follow up before anything athletic entered the conversation again. Nothing in those instructions prepared me for how much Leah would hate being treated like someone recovering from an injury. She had spent years measuring days by practice blocks, school bells, conditioning, homework, and how quickly she could shower before dinner. Now 10 minutes of reading could make the letters swim. A bright room could send her upstairs with one hand over her eyes. She would wake convinced she felt normal, try to do something ordinary, and discover 20 minutes later that her head had other plans. The first morning she tried schoolwork from home. She lasted 13 minutes before closing the laptop. She did not complain. That worried me more than complaining would have. By the third day, I found her sitting at the dining table with both elbows planted beside an untouched worksheet. Her phone was in a basket across the room because we had agreed she would keep it away while symptoms were bad. She had already asked twice when she could use it normally again. I brought her an audiobook I thought she might tolerate better. She stared at the cover on my tablet, then at me. So, concussion recovery is just being grounded by a neurologist. I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound startled both of us. For 3 days, everything in the house had been careful. Doors closed gently. The television stayed off. I moved around, as if noise itself could bruise her. Even Evan, who had stayed nearby through the first 48 hours before returning to Orange County, had spoken more quietly than usual. Leah's joke cracked something open. She smiled too, though only for a second. Then she pressed 2 fingers to her temple and leaned back from the light. That was how recovery worked at first. A glimpse of my daughter, followed by a reminder that she was not yet fully back inside her own life. The police follow-up began without drama. An investigator contacted me, confirmed the basic information from my report, and arranged to collect what I had been sent by Dana. I was told not to conduct my own investigation or pressure Leah into repeatedly recounting the incident. If they needed a formal statement from her, they would handle it in an age-appropriate way, after considering her medical condition. I was grateful for that instruction because every instinct in me wanted answers. I wanted to know exactly what Simone had said after Dana removed Leah. I wanted to know when Simone decided the red warning did not apply. I wanted to know whether anyone else had been standing close enough to hear. I wanted to know how long Leah had sat out, how she had looked, whether she had asked to compete first, or whether the idea had been placed in front of her. But wanting answers did not make me entitled to extract them from a child whose head still hurt when she tried to concentrate. So I waited. Waiting turned out to be harder than anger. Anger gave me somewhere to stand. Waiting left me alone, with possibilities. Pacific Crest contacted me before the end of that week. Gwen Park, the owner, did not try to excuse what had happened. She told me Simone had been removed from athlete contact while the club conducted its safety review and while the external processes moved forward. The meet host had already confirmed the sequence of Leah's rotations and the medical incident log. Gwen also acknowledged that the paper-based system had failed to create a second barrier after Simone neglected to scratch Leah from the lineup. That mattered to me, but not in the way people expected. I did not need Pacific Crest to tell me the system could have been better. I knew it could. I had spent my professional life looking at systems that failed because everybody assumed the previous person had handled something. What I needed was for nobody to use that failure to blur Simone's choice. Dana had removed Leah. Simone had signed the acknowledgement. The floor staff had not received a separate automatic block. Those facts could all exist at the same time. The existence of a weak safeguard did not turn the person who crossed it into a passenger. A few days later, Gwen sent me the club's preliminary incident summary. It was not a secret document and did not contain some hidden confession. Most of it simply repeated the timeline I already knew. Leah fell in warm-up. Dana evaluated her. Simone received the restriction. Leah returned to floor. Leah collapsed. Then I reached Simone's account. She had written that Leah reported feeling better after resting and expressed a clear desire to compete. I read the sentence 3 times, not because I thought Simone was lying, because I knew she probably wasn't. Leah had already told me Simone said she could choose. I had heard the shame in Leah's voice when she asked whether the team lost because of her. It was entirely possible that, when Simone put the decision in front of her, my daughter had said yes. That word complicated nothing legally in my mind. It complicated everything, emotionally. For several days, I had been able to organize the incident into a clean shape. Adult ignores safety restriction, child gets hurt. Now another truth sat beside it. The child had participated in the decision, not with adult authority, not with full information, not in a condition where her judgment should have been treated as clearance. But she had still said yes. And I could already see how adults would use that word. Simone had started with it. Leah wanted to compete. Mom had already repeated some version of it over the phone before I stopped taking her calls for a few days. Dad had said he was not trying to defend Simone, then immediately asked whether it mattered that Leah had insisted she felt better. It mattered to them because they were searching for shared responsibility. It mattered to me because I was beginning to understand how quickly children could be handed responsibility adults did not want to carry. Leah did not go back to school full-time. For the first week, she stayed home entirely. After that, she tried a few shortened days. The school worked with us, and her teachers reduced what they could. The accommodations helped, though Leah hated being escorted out of class when symptoms returned. She hated people looking at her almost as much as she hated the headaches. By the second week, she had started asking whether the girls at the gym thought she was weak. The question came sideways. She wondered whether anyone had posted about the meet, then whether Pacific Crest had competed again, then whether Simone's suspension meant the team had another coach. Each question sounded practical until I noticed that she never asked how she herself was doing compared with other concussion patients. She asked how everyone else was doing without her. Brooke came over on a Saturday afternoon. I nearly said no. Not because I did not trust Brooke, but because I was afraid of anything connected to the gym entering the house before Leah was ready. Then, Leah heard me discussing it with Evan on the phone, and became irritated that I was considering deciding on her behalf. That irritation was useful. It reminded me that protection could become a habit before I noticed the shape it was taking. So Brooke came. She brought a bag of sour candy. Leah was not particularly interested in eating, and enough school gossip to fill the first half hour without mentioning gymnastics once. From the kitchen, I could hear their voices moving in and out of laughter. Not long conversations, just the rhythms of two teenagers who knew which teachers assigned too much homework, which classmate had embarrassed himself in front of half the grade, and which song Brooke had decided was so bad that playing it should count as a disciplinary offense. I stayed out of the room as much as I could. That was harder than it sounds. When your child has been hurt inside a world you trusted, every new sentence from that world starts sounding like evidence. I had to keep reminding myself Brooke was 14. She had come to see her friend, not testify. Eventually, gymnastics entered the conversation because of course it did. Brooke told Leah the team had adjusted lineups and was still practicing. The new arrangement was awkward, but nobody had fallen apart. A few girls had asked when Leah might visit. One had cried after hearing what happened. Leah asked whether anyone blamed her for the score. Brooke sounded genuinely confused by the question. She said the team had been terrified when Leah went down. The score had become irrelevant the moment the ambulance came. That should have comforted Leah. Instead, she looked at her hands. A little later, Brooke mentioned something else so casually that I almost missed its importance. One of the younger girls had finally told the coach her ankle had been hurting for several days. Brooke said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing an ordinary habit. Girls often waited until after a meet to mention pain, because nobody wanted to be the reason a coach had to rearrange a lineup. The sentence settled into me slowly, not because it proved anything about Simone's decision that day, because it showed me the environment in which the decision had landed. I had thought Leah's pressure came mostly from our family. Maybe family had simply given a larger language to something the sport already rewarded. Be available. Be dependable. Do not become the problem someone else has to solve. Brooke did not sound frightened of Simone. She did not describe secret punishments or threats. That almost made it worse. A culture did not need to be openly cruel to teach children which inconveniences they were supposed to hide. After Brooke left, Leah was exhausted. She went upstairs before dinner and slept nearly 2 hours. When she came down, she found me washing dishes and asked why I had been listening. I denied spying because, technically, I had not stood outside the door. But both of us knew the kitchen had been close enough for me to hear parts of the conversation. Her mouth tightened. She told me she did not want Brooke turned into a witness. That word stopped me. I dried my hands and sat down across from her. Leah looked tired again. Not physically this time. Tired of adults taking pieces of her life and assigning them functions. Dana had become evidence. The form had become evidence. The meat had become a case. Now Brooke's casual words risked becoming something else to catalog. I told Leah she was right. Brooke had come as her friend. I would not question her. Leah nodded. But the tension did not leave her shoulders. Then, she said the thing she had been circling since she woke in the hospital. Nobody forced her onto the floor. She had agreed. There was no self-defense in her voice. It sounded more like confession. She reminded me that Simone had given her a choice, and that she had said she wanted to continue. By then, her headache had eased a little. She thought she could finish. She knew the team would have to change the lineup if she stopped. She did not want everyone's work to become harder because of her. I listened without interrupting. The urge to tell her none of it was her fault rose so quickly that I nearly did. But the phrase felt too simple. Leah was not asking whether Simone was responsible. She was trying to understand what her own yes meant. If I erased it completely, I risked telling her she had no agency. If I treated it like an adult decision, I would repeat the exact mistake Simone had made. So, I kept my answer smaller. I told her she had made a choice inside a situation an adult should never have placed on her shoulders. She stared at the table. Then she said maybe she should have known better. That was the first time shame became visible instead of hiding behind concern for the team. Leah had begun to reinterpret her collapse as proof of personal weakness, not just injury, failure. She said she had felt better after resting. She had seen other girls compete sore, taped, exhausted. She had trained through ordinary pain before. Maybe she had panicked. Maybe she had made the first fall look worse than it was. Maybe she had been dramatic enough for Dana to pull her, and then stupid enough to go back out. The words came faster as she went. I stopped her before she could build a whole case against herself. I reminded her of the facts the doctor had given us. Headache, dizziness, visual difficulty. A second impact, loss of consciousness. Weeks of symptoms she was still living with. Her body had not been dramatic. It had been injured. Leah blinked hard and looked away. What she said next came quietly. Aunt Simone said I looked better. That was the first time she started telling me what happened inside the area I had not been allowed to enter. I did not turn on my phone. I did not take notes. I did not ask her to start from the beginning. I let her tell it in the order her memory offered it. After Dana removed her, Leah sat in the warm-up area and waited. Her headache eased from sharp to dull. The dizziness settled enough that standing felt possible again. Simone came back after checking the lineup. According to Leah, Simone did not say Dana was incompetent or order her onto the floor. She did something more effective. She minimized the situation. Dana had to be cautious. Athletic trainers were supposed to be conservative with anything involving the head. Leah knew herself. If she truly felt bad, nobody would blame her for stopping. Then Simone explained what would happen if she did. The lineup would change. Another athlete would move into Leah's spot. Warm-ups would shift. The team could handle it, Simone said. That last part mattered because it sounded generous. Leah remembered Simone telling her the choice was hers. But choices are shaped by what adults place beside them. Nobody will blame you. The team will adjust. Everyone worked all season. You know your body. And then Simone had added one sentence. Your mom always says you finish what you start. I went completely still, not because Simone had invented the phrase, because she hadn't. It was mine. I had said versions of it over homework, piano lessons Leah abandoned after 6 months, commitments to friends, chores, school projects, gymnastics seasons. Finish what you start. I had never meant finish while injured. I had never meant obey a coach over medical staff. I had never meant your body gets the final vote, only after everybody else is satisfied. But children do not receive only the meaning adults intend. They receive the rule. I could hear myself saying it at the kitchen island the morning of the meet. Finish the season, then we can talk. The banana in Leah's hand. The way she had nodded. The way I had mistaken compliance for resolution. I did not tell her any of that yet. If I had started apologizing in that moment, she would have had to manage me. Instead, I asked what she had said after Simone mentioned me. Leah rubbed the edge of one thumbnail with the other. She had told Simone she thought she could compete. Simone accepted the answer. That was all. No threat, no dramatic command, no secret bargain. A 14-year-old with concussion symptoms said what she believed the adults wanted to hear, and the adult responsible for saying no accepted it because yes was convenient. The simplicity of it made my stomach turn. For the next several days, I noticed the phrase everywhere. Finish your homework. Finish what you promised. Finish the season. Follow through. Be dependable. None of those ideas were inherently wrong. That was what made them difficult to confront. We teach children persistence, because persistence matters. We teach them not to abandon people whenever something becomes uncomfortable. We praise effort, because effort builds confidence. But somewhere between persistence and obedience there was a boundary I had never taught Leah to name. I had shown her how to keep going. I was no longer sure I had shown her how to stop. The following week, Gwen confirmed Simone's suspension would remain in place while the reviews continued. Mom left several voicemails I did not answer. Dad sent shorter messages, mostly asking how Leah was doing and whether there was anything practical he could bring. I responded only when the question was actually about Leah. The family had begun dividing itself without anyone announcing the division. Mom saw silence as punishment. Dad saw it as temporary. I saw it as the only way I could keep from spending Leah's recovery arguing about Simone. Leah returned to school for longer stretches. The headaches became less constant, though concentration still tired her faster than before. Some evenings she seemed almost normal. Others, an hour of homework left her pale and irritable. One Thursday, she came home after making it through nearly a full day and dropped her backpack beside the sofa. I told her I was proud of her for getting through it. The words left my mouth before I thought about them. Proud for enduring. Proud for finishing. Leah did not react badly. She probably did not even hear the connection. I did. That night, I stood in the kitchen after she went upstairs and looked at the calendar still hanging beside the refrigerator. Competition dates filled the spring. Practice blocks. Meets. Travel weekends. A life organized around continuation. One small note in my handwriting sat 3 weeks before the accident. Leah Friend's birthday? I remembered the conversation. She had asked whether she could miss an optional Sunday practice to attend a birthday party. I had told her to check with Simone, because the meet season was busy. She had gone to practice. Another memory surfaced behind it. Leah asking whether summer training would be the same schedule as last year. Leah wondering whether recreational gymnasts ever competed. Leah complaining that she never knew what her school friends were talking about on Monday because she missed half their weekend plans. At the time, each question had been ordinary. Now they looked connected. The next evening, Leah was sitting on the back steps with a blanket around her shoulders. The light was soft enough not to bother her, and for once she was not wearing the expression of someone calculating whether an activity would cause symptoms later. I sat beside her. I did not ask about Simone. I did not ask about the police. I did not ask whether she still blamed herself. I went back to the kitchen that morning. I reminded her that before the meet, she had said she was tired of everything being about competition. Then I asked whether she had been thinking about quitting. Leah's head turned toward me. For the first time since the accident, the correction came immediately. Not gymnastics. She pulled the blanket tighter around her knees. Competitive gymnastics. The distinction landed differently. I waited. Leah looked out across the yard instead of at me. When she finally spoke again, her voice had none of the uncertainty I expected. I'd been trying to figure out how to tell you for 6 weeks. For 6 weeks. That was the number Leah gave me, and once she said it, the past rearranged itself with a cruelty I had not expected. Nothing new had happened. No hidden message appeared. No secret diary turned up. I simply began remembering conversations I had already lived through and understanding them differently. The first one had been about a birthday party. A girl from Leah's science class had invited her to a Sunday afternoon gathering at a bowling alley. Leah had asked whether she could skip an optional practice. I remembered standing at the stove while pasta water boiled, telling her the season was busy and suggesting she check with Simone before deciding. Simone had said the extra practice would be useful. Leah went to the gym. At the time, the entire exchange had seemed responsible. Leah had made a commitment to a competitive team. Optional did not necessarily mean meaningless. I had not ordered her to go. I had not threatened punishment. But sitting beside her on the back steps, weeks after the accident, I understood what she had heard. The decision did not truly belong to her, unless the adults around her approved it first. Leah had other examples. She had asked what recreational gymnastics was like. I had answered that it depended on the gym, and assumed she was curious about younger girls she saw training on the other side of Pacific Crest. She had asked whether high school gymnasts ever had time for school clubs. I had told her plenty did, though serious athletes had to manage their schedules carefully. She had complained that Sunday evenings made her stomach hurt before Monday practice. I had suggested we look at whether she was getting enough sleep and eating properly on meet weekends. She had wondered what our summer would look like if she took time off. I had told her we would discuss summer after the current season. Every response made sense alone. Together, they formed a conversation I had somehow failed to hear. Leah had never marched into the kitchen and declared that she wanted to leave competitive gymnastics. She had approached the idea the way children often approach something they suspect will disappoint the adults around them sideways, in fragments, testing whether the subject was safe, before placing the whole truth on the table. I had answered each fragment. I had never answered the question beneath them. The realization did not arrive as some dramatic moment of enlightenment. It came through small physical things. My hand staying too long on the coffee mug. The calendar beside the refrigerator becoming difficult to look at. A stack of competition schedules I suddenly wanted out of sight. Leah kept talking. She said she had tried several times to imagine exactly how she would tell me. In every version, she heard the same word before I ever said it. Quit. That word had acquired so much weight in our family that she had begun avoiding it before anyone accused her of anything. I knew where that came from. I was 15 when I told my mother I wanted to leave gymnastics. Until Leah's accident, I had remembered that conversation as proof that my parents had not been cruel. Mom had been sitting at our old kitchen table, sorting receipts from a meat fundraiser. Simone had practiced that evening. I had spent the entire bus ride home rehearsing how to explain that I did not want another season. When I finally said it, Mom had gone quiet. She did not call me lazy. She did not threaten to take anything away. She talked instead about the years already invested, the early mornings, the travel, the fees, the opportunities that might never come back. She asked whether I was certain I wanted to throw away something I had worked so hard to build. Throw away. I had forgotten that phrase until then. Dad came into the kitchen halfway through the conversation and listened without choosing a side. His neutrality had felt reasonable at the time. As an adult, I could see that silence also had weight, when one parent was describing a child's decision as waste. Simone was 18 and still training. She never mocked me for leaving. She did not have to. For the next few years, family stories did the work. Simone saw things through. Simone knew how to push herself. Simone understood that hard periods passed. I was still loved, still included, still praised for other things. But the grammar of our family quietly divided us into two examples: the daughter who endured, the daughter who stopped. I had spent 23 years insisting that distinction no longer mattered to me. Then I raised my own daughter and taught her to finish what she started. Not because I wanted to become my mother, because I thought I was correcting her. I never cared whether Leah won. I never punished bad scores. I never compared her with another gymnast. When she cried after a difficult practice, I held her. When she struggled with a skill, I told her fear was normal. But beneath all those improvements, I had preserved one piece of the old structure. Stopping required justification. Continuing did not. Leah shifted the blanket around her knees while I sat beside her, the backyard quiet except for a neighbor's lawnmower somewhere beyond the fence. I asked what she actually wanted. She answered carefully, as though she expected me to mistake one choice for another again. She did not want to give up gymnastics. That distinction mattered to her enough that I could hear irritation each time I used the wrong word. She still loved the physical part of it. She loved the instant when a movement that had felt impossible became muscle memory. She loved the first clean landing after weeks of frustration. She loved chalk on her palms, even though she complained about finding it everywhere afterward. She loved being upside down. She loved laughing with Brooke while they waited for turns. She loved the peculiar satisfaction of repeating something difficult until fear became familiar. What she no longer loved was everything built around those moments. Every meal becoming fuel, every weekend already belonging to a schedule, every ache carrying the question of whether it was serious enough to matter, every family gathering eventually turning towards scores, meets, levels, or Simone's team. She said she sometimes felt as though people did not ask how gymnastics was going because they were interested in what she loved. They asked because gymnast had become the easiest way to describe her. That hurt because I had done it too. At work, when someone asked about Leah, I often said she was doing well and then mentioned a meet result. At family dinners, I asked about school and friends, but I could remember how quickly I moved toward practice whenever the conversation slowed. It was not because I only valued her as an athlete. Intent again. Intent was becoming the weakest defense in our family. Leah wanted to finish the season, and then move to something less competitive. Maybe recreational training, maybe a lower pressure program, maybe a break while she decided whether she missed the sport or only the people inside it. She had not yet settled on an answer. That was another thing I had failed to understand. She had not needed me to approve a final plan. She had needed room to be uncertain. A few days later, she told me something about the meet that changed the meaning of the entire morning for me. When Dana first told her she could not compete, Leah had felt relieved. The word looked strange beside everything else that happened. Relieved. I had assumed the medical restriction must have frightened or disappointed her. Competitive athletes work for months toward meets. Being pulled hours before a routine should have felt devastating. For Leah, it had briefly felt like escape. The decision had been taken out of her hands. She did not have to be the girl who quit. She did not have to decide whether she was letting her teammates down. She did not have to watch Simone's face while asking to stop. A medical professional had done it for her. For a few minutes, Leah could simply obey. Then Simone came back. By then, Leah's headache had eased enough for doubt to enter. The dizziness was less intense. She could stand. Simone told her Dana had to be cautious. She reminded Leah that the lineup would change but framed it as something the team could manage. Nobody would blame her. That phrase sounded kind until it was placed beside the other things Leah already believed. Nobody will blame you meant there was something blame could logically attach itself to. The team will adjust meant there would be consequences other people had to absorb. You know your body meant the medically restricted child had suddenly become responsible for deciding whether the restriction was excessive. Then came my phrase. Your mom always says you finish what you start. Leah told me the relief disappeared almost immediately after that. Not because Simone threatened her, because the decision was hers again. And Leah had already spent 6 weeks trying to imagine how to stop without disappointing us. I sat with that for a long time. The worst truths in families are not always hidden. Sometimes everyone has been saying them aloud for years, but nobody understands what they sound like from the smallest chair at the table. I started apologizing. It happened too fast. I told Leah I should have listened better. I told her I never wanted her to think my love depended on whether she competed. I told her I had not understood what those phrases had become in her head. The words piled up because guilt loves urgency. If I could explain myself completely enough, maybe she would understand that I had not meant to put that weight on her. Leah listened for less than a minute before her face closed. Not anger, exhaustion. She had spent weeks recovering from a brain injury and days answering questions from doctors, school staff, investigators, and me. Now my apology was quietly asking her for one more thing: reassurance. She did not give it. Instead, she told me she did not want to spend recovery proving that I was a good mother. The sentence landed harder than if she had accused me. I stopped speaking. The porch suddenly seemed full of all the words I had been using to make myself feel less guilty. I had almost made the same mistake in a different form. Again, an adult's emotion had entered the room, and Leah had been placed in the position of managing it. So I did something that felt unnatural to me. I let the apology remain incomplete. I told her she did not have to make me feel better. Then I stayed quiet. There was no immediate healing scene after that. She did not lean against my shoulder. We did not cry together. She eventually went inside because the evening light was starting to bother her eyes, and I stayed on the steps with the blanket she had forgotten behind. That felt more honest than a hug would have. By early June, Leah's headaches had become less frequent, though concentration still cost her more than it used to. She could manage longer school days. She began finishing assignments without needing to rest halfway through. Some evenings I heard her laughing with friends through the wall, and felt the tension in my body ease before I remembered that recovery was not a straight line. One difficult morning could still wipe out an afternoon. Her doctors remained cautious about athletic activity. So did I. Meanwhile, everything outside our house kept moving. The police investigation continued in the background. Dana's documentation had been preserved. The meet timeline had been reviewed. Pacific Crest maintained Simone's suspension. I provided what investigators requested and resisted the urge to turn every update into a family referendum. Mom made that difficult. She had respected the physical distance I demanded after the hospital, but she did not understand why I refused to help define what had happened. Her request came during a phone call I almost did not answer. She started by asking about Leah. The question was genuine. Mom wanted to know whether the headaches were improving and whether school was easier. For a few minutes, she sounded like the grandmother who remembered Leah's snacks and birthdays, not the woman who had asked about the team score beside a hospital bed. Then the purpose of the call surfaced. Mom wanted me to be careful with the language I used when speaking to investigators and the gym. She did not ask me to lie. That would have been simpler. She wanted me to say Simone had made a judgment call. A terrible one, Mom admitted. A decision she regretted, but still a judgment call by a coach who had believed an athlete was capable of continuing. I listened while Mom talked about Simone's career. More than 20 years in the sport. Years building trust with families. The program she had helped grow. The reputation she could lose. The longer Mom spoke, the more I noticed something familiar. Investment. Years. Sacrifice. Everything already spent. It was the same accounting she had used when I wanted to leave gymnastics at 15. If enough had been invested, Stopping became waste. Now, if enough had been invested in Simone's career, accountability became destruction. I told Mom I would not describe Simone's intentions for anyone. I knew what I had seen. I knew what Dana's form said. I knew what Simone had admitted at the hospital. If investigators asked me whether I believed my sister meant for Leah to collapse, I would say no, because I did not believe that. But I would not turn knowingly ignoring a removal order into an innocent difference of professional opinion just because the truth had become expensive. Mom went quiet. Then she said Simone could lose everything she had worked for. I looked through the kitchen doorway toward the sofa, where Leah was reading for 20 minutes before taking the break she had finally learned to take without apologizing. Mom was worried about Simone losing her career. My daughter was relearning whether she could trust the signals coming from her own body. There was nothing useful left to say. I ended the call before anger turned it into a fight. But Mom's fear stayed with me. So did mine. That was the problem. By then, I could identify almost every way the adults around Leah had failed her. I could see Simone's arrogance. I could see Mom's obsession with preserving what had already been invested. I could see Dad's instinct to shrink conflict until everyone could live beside it. What I could not yet see clearly was what fear was beginning to do to me. It started with small decisions. I removed meet notifications from the family calendar. I put Leah's medals in a storage box because seeing them made my stomach tighten. I told myself I was only clearing visual clutter while she recovered. I stopped reading emails from Pacific Crest, unless they related directly to the investigation. When a gymnastics video appeared on Leah's phone while she was scrolling beside me, my eyes moved to it before hers did. I watched everything associated with the sport, as if danger might somehow announce itself early the next time. Then one afternoon, Leah asked whether her membership at Pacific Crest would simply remain frozen until she was medically cleared. The question was practical. My answer was not. I told her she would not be going back to Pacific Crest. That part was reasonable. Simone had coached there. The environment had failed her. Leah did not argue. Then I kept going. I told her she was done with competitive gymnastics. Still no argument. The silence made me feel safer. So I finished the decision for her. I told her I did not want her returning to gymnastics at all. Not Pacific Crest. Not another team. Not recreationally. Not after clearance. Not next year. I would not spend the rest of my life sitting in bleachers, wondering whether a headache was beginning behind her eyes. I would not trust another coach to distinguish ambition from danger. I would not watch Leah launch herself over a floor and remember the sound of her body coming down wrong. The reasoning felt airtight while I was saying it. For once, I would be the adult who stopped things before they became catastrophic. I expected relief. Instead, Leah looked at me the way she had looked at Simone's form when I finally showed her a simplified version of what had happened. As if she understood every word, but could not believe the person responsible for protecting her had reached that conclusion. She did not raise her voice. That made what she said worse. They wouldn't let me stop when I wanted to. Her hands were flat against the kitchen table. There was no chalk on them anymore. Then she looked directly at me. Now, you won't let me decide if I ever go back. Leah's words stayed between us long after the kitchen had gone quiet. They wouldn't let me stop when I wanted to. Now you won't let me decide if I ever go back. I had spent weeks telling myself that I was different from Simone because my fear came from love. I was not asking Leah to ignore pain. I was not asking her to protect a score, a coach, or a team. I was trying to keep her alive. That explanation had felt complete until my daughter held up the part I had refused to examine. Simone had taken away Leah's right to stop. I was trying to take away her right to return. The motives were different. The danger was different. But somewhere underneath both decisions sat the same assumption. An adult's certainty mattered more than Leah's ownership of her own body and future. I did not admit that immediately. For several days, I did what people often do when they have been confronted with a truth they do not yet know how to live by. I became careful, too careful. I stopped bringing up gymnastics. I stopped mentioning Pacific Crest. I stopped asking whether Leah had thought any more about what she wanted after recovery. I told myself I was giving her space. What I was really doing was waiting for the subject to become safe enough that I would not have to feel afraid when it came up. Leah noticed. She noticed everything. Our house developed a strange politeness. She followed every medical instruction. She took breaks when headaches returned. She used the reduced school schedule without arguing. She left her phone downstairs when screen time started bothering her eyes. If I asked whether she needed anything, she usually said she was fine. The problem was that fine began replacing the 100 small things she used to tell me. Before the accident, Leah had narrated parts of her day almost accidentally. She would complain about a class assignment while opening the refrigerator, repeat something Brooke had said while tying her shoes, or announce that a teacher had used the phrase participation grade, like it was a personal insult. Now those details disappeared. She still spoke to me. She just stopped volunteering. I would walk past her room and see her phone light up with messages from teammates, then darken when I entered. If I asked whether anyone had written, she gave me the shortest possible answer. Once I found her smiling at something on the screen. The smile vanished when she noticed me in the doorway. I did not ask what she had been reading. That restraint felt like progress, until I realized she had expected me to ask. The first month after the accident, I had measured safety and symptoms, headache severity, minutes of screen tolerance, hours at school, how long she could read before needing quiet. By June, another measure had become impossible to ignore. My daughter was becoming easier to manage and harder to reach. There is a kind of parenting mistake that looks excellent from across the room. The child follows instructions. The appointments are attended. The homework is completed. Nobody fights. Nothing breaks. It can take time to understand that compliance and trust are not the same thing. That became obvious during one of Leah's follow-up appointments. The concussion specialist was not new to us by then. She had been part of Leah's recovery plan since shortly after discharge, and her office had none of the dramatic machinery I associated with the hospital. No alarms, no rolling beds, just soft overhead lights, a computer, a few balance tools, and a laminated diagram on the wall that Leah had already read often enough to be bored by it. Her physical symptoms had improved. The headaches were less frequent. She could tolerate longer school days and more reading. The doctor went over progress, reviewed what still triggered symptoms, and adjusted the next stage without making recovery sound either fragile or automatic. Then she asked Leah what she wanted to be able to do again. The question was ordinary. That was why it caught me. Leah did not answer immediately. She picked at the edge of the paper covering the exam table and said she wanted to get through a full school day without needing to lie down afterward. She wanted to read for as long as she used to. She wanted to hang out with friends without calculating whether noise would make her head hurt. Then she said, more cautiously, that someday she wanted to know whether being in a gym still felt good. My body reacted before my mouth did. My shoulders tightened. The doctor noticed. Leah did too. I had already begun forming the argument in my head. The second impact. The loss of consciousness. The months of symptoms. The fact that another gym could still have bad coaches, bad systems, bad judgment. The doctor did not argue with me because I had not said any of it. She simply continued asking Leah questions about what being in a gym meant to her. Not competition, not rankings, not returning to full training. Just what she imagined when she said she wanted to know. Leah described movement, stretching, basic skills, the smell of chalk, being around people doing something she still loved. The doctor did not promise she would be ready soon. She did not give permission that day. She explained that any athletic return would depend on recovery. medical clearance, and gradual progression. But she treated Leah's goal as information worth hearing, not as danger to be eliminated. I sat there with my hands folded too tightly in my lap and watched another adult do something I had forgotten how to do. Ask, not decide. The appointment ended without any dramatic breakthrough. We left with another set of recovery instructions and a follow-up date. Leah complained in the elevator that medical buildings all smelled like somebody had tried to disinfect sadness. Normally, I would have laughed. This time I did, but the sound came with discomfort. I had spent so much time thinking about how adults had failed to hear Leah that I had not noticed how quickly I had started doing the same thing in the opposite direction. Thomas came to the house alone a week later. That itself was unusual. My parents had operated as a pair for as long as I could remember. Even when they disagreed, they arrived together, left together, and usually presented a shared version of whatever the disagreement had been by the time anyone else heard about it. Dad texted first and asked whether Leah was comfortable seeing him. He did not mention Mom. He did not ask whether he could drop by, as though access were assumed. I let Leah decide. She shrugged and said he could come. I heard the caution in that answer, but also something else. She missed him. That was one of the hardest things about setting boundaries with people you love. The boundary does not erase the part of you that still remembers the relationship before it became complicated. Dad arrived carrying a paper bag from a bakery Leah liked. No flowers, no gift basket, no attempt to make the visit look larger than it was. He stood inside the living room longer than necessary, then asked whether it was okay if he sat in the armchair. Leah looked up from the sofa. I could see her trying to determine whether he was joking. He wasn't. A few minutes later, he opened the bakery bag, took out a cookie, then paused and asked whether he should leave them for Leah instead. That was when she finally broke. "Grandpa, you don't need informed consent for a cookie." Dad stared at her. Then he laughed. Not loudly. Just enough to make the room feel familiar for the first time since he entered. Leah smiled too. The moment lasted maybe 5 seconds. It mattered anyway. Dad ate the cookie. He did not use the visit to defend Simone. For most of the first half hour, he talked about ordinary things. A cabinet hinge he had been fixing at home. A neighbor's fence that had somehow become a community argument. Leah's school schedule. He asked whether reading still made her head hurt, and listened to the answer without connecting it to Simone. I knew the difficult part was coming, because Dad kept rubbing his thumb along the seam of the paper bakery bag. Eventually, he told me he had been thinking about the phrase he kept using. One mistake. He had said it at the hospital. He had said it again afterward. Every time the seriousness of what Simone had done became harder to avoid, he reduced it to a single bad decision. He admitted that the language protected him. If it was one mistake, then the family could eventually recover by treating it like an exception. If Simone's decision had grown from something deeper, something all of us had heard and reinforced for years, then he would have to look backward, not just forward. Dad did not suddenly become eloquent about family dysfunction. That was not who he was. He said he had spent his whole life fixing things by making them smaller first. A broken pipe became a valve. A damaged wall became a section of drywall. A family fight became 2 people who needed to calm down. That method had worked well enough in his career as a building inspector, and badly enough everywhere else. He still did not say he believed Simone deserved criminal consequences. He was not ready to cross that distance yet, but he stopped asking me to make the distance disappear. He said he would not ask me to retract anything or soften what I told investigators. For Dad, that was not a complete transformation. It was a beginning. Leah listened from the sofa without being asked to forgive him. He did not ask whether she was angry. He did not ask for a hug. When he left, he asked whether she wanted him to come again sometime. She said maybe. Dad nodded as though maybe were a full answer. That, more than the apology, told me something had shifted. Mom handled boundaries differently. She treated them like negotiations that had gone temporarily badly. She called several times that month. When I did not answer, she sent messages framed as concern for Leah. Some were genuine. She remembered a school event and asked whether Leah had been able to attend. She sent a recipe for a smoothie Leah used to like after training. Then, inevitably, Simone appeared inside the conversation. Mom wanted Leah to know that Simone thought about her constantly. She wanted Leah to know Simone was devastated. She wanted Leah to understand that her aunt had never stopped loving her. I did not pass those messages along. Mom interpreted that as cruelty. The conflict came to a head when she arrived one afternoon without being invited. She did not force her way inside. She stood on the porch holding a small envelope and said it was from Simone. I did not take it. Mom looked genuinely shocked. She insisted it was only a message. No legal material. No argument. Just something Simone wanted Leah to have. I told her Leah would decide if and when she wanted contact from Simone. Mom's face tightened in the familiar way it did when she believed I was confusing stubbornness with principle. She said family could not teach children to hold grudges every time an adult failed them. That sentence carried enough history that I almost answered with all of it. The hospital, the form, the red letters, the fact that Leah had felt relief when Dana removed her. Instead, I kept the answer where the boundary actually belonged. Leah was recovering. She did not owe Simone access to make Simone feel forgiven. Mom could either respect that or lose direct access herself. The envelope remained in her hand. For a moment, the woman on my porch was both versions of my mother at once. The grandmother who remembered snacks, the mother who could not stop placing Simone's pain beside Leah's and asking me to weigh them. She left with the envelope. Afterward, I stood behind the closed door with one hand still on the lock. I checked it twice. The second time embarrassed me, not because I thought Mom would force her way in, because fear had started attaching itself to ordinary things. Doors, phones, gym bags, the word practice. I was learning that trauma did not need permission to become a system. A few nights later, I sat on the edge of Leah's bed and told her I had been wrong. Not wrong to keep her out of gymnastics while she was medically restricted. Not wrong to refuse Pacific Crest. Wrong to decide that the entire rest of her athletic life belonged to my fear. I did not give her a speech about autonomy. Leah was 14. She did not need terminology. I told her there were two separate decisions. The first was medical. Until qualified professionals cleared her, there was no gymnastics. That part was not negotiable. The second was what happened afterward. Evan agreed that any athletic return had to follow the medical team, but beyond that, he did not try to decide the answer for Leah or turn the Mercer family conflict into a custody fight. That part could not be mine alone. Leah watched me carefully. I told her I was not promising a particular outcome. I still did not know whether I could support a return to competitive gymnastics. I did not know whether she would even want one by the time her body was ready. But when that day came, we would talk about what she wanted, instead of me announcing her future from the kitchen. The change in her expression was small. Her shoulders loosened. That was all. No hug. No sudden restoration of the way things had been. Trust, I was discovering, did not return because the adult finally said the correct sentence. It came back through repetition, through the next choice, and the next one. Through proving that you can decide did not disappear the moment the answer became inconvenient. The investigation continued while our house slowly learned a different rhythm. A detective met with me again and reviewed the existing chronology. I provided Dana's original message and confirmed how I had received the form. The investigation was methodical rather than dramatic. What mattered was who knew what and when. I answered what I could and said I did not know when I did not. The club's review continued separately, including the failure of a paper removal to create a second safety barrier on the competition floor. That system weakness deserved repair. but it did not change who had received the restriction and returned Leah to competition. I no longer needed to make Simone look worse than the facts made her. By July, Leah could manage full school-type cognitive days more consistently. Though summer had taken school itself out of the equation, she spent more time with friends. She slept less during daylight. The headaches were becoming occasional, instead of constant. One afternoon she came downstairs after a video call with Brooke and asked whether I had heard anything about her next medical appointment. The question sounded casual. I knew better than to answer the question underneath it before she asked. I told her the date. She nodded. Then she asked whether the doctor might eventually clear her for more physical activity. I said that was possible if her symptoms continued improving and if the medical team believed it was safe. Leah stood beside the kitchen counter, twisting a hair tie around 2 fingers. It was the same nervous hand habit Simone had noticed on the morning of the meet. For a second, I saw the competition floor so clearly that my palms went cold. Leah noticed. She looked at my hands before looking at my face. Then she asked the question I had been dreading without admitting it. If I ever go back, are you going to look at me like I'm about to die every time I jump? My first instinct was to deny it. That would have been easier. I could have promised that by then I would be fine, that enough time would pass, that medical clearance would make the fear disappear. But Leah had spent months surrounded by adults whose confidence exceeded what they actually knew. I did not want to become one more. So, I told her the truth. I might be scared. The sound of a bad landing might take me somewhere I did not want to go. I might have to learn how to sit with that fear longer than either of us would like. Then I told her the part I could promise. I would not make her responsible for fixing it. Her face softened, but she did not answer immediately. She unwrapped the hair tie from her fingers and placed it on the counter. That small movement stayed with me. For months, I had believed protecting Leah meant removing every dangerous possibility before it could reach her. Now I was beginning to understand the harder version of protection. Someday, if the doctor said it was safe and Leah still wanted to try, I might have to stand on the other side of a gym and watch my daughter make a choice that terrified me. And this time, my fear would have to belong to me. By August, the worst part of Leah's recovery was no longer what she could not do. It was not knowing what any of the things she could do meant. Her headaches had become less frequent. She could read for long stretches again. Noise did not flatten her the way it had in May. She was sleeping normally most nights, and the summer days had gradually filled with friends, errands, school orientation, and the ordinary boredom of being 14 in a house where nothing dramatic was scheduled. From a medical point of view, progress was easier to describe. From Leah's point of view, it had created a new problem. People kept asking whether she was going back. Not whether she felt better. Not whether she missed it. Going back. The phrase followed her through the last weeks of summer, as if her life had been paused in April, and everyone expected her eventually to press play. At freshman orientation, one of the girls from middle school recognized her near the registration tables and immediately asked whether she was still the gymnast. Leah smiled politely and said she was figuring things out. Later, while we waited in line for student ID photos, she told me she hated the way one sport had somehow become a noun. She did not sound angry with the girl. She sounded tired of being summarized. For years I had done the same thing without noticing. If somebody at work asked about my daughter, I mentioned school and then gymnastics. If a relative had not seen Leah in months, one of the first updates I gave was usually a score, a level, or a meet. I had thought I was celebrating something she loved. Now I wondered how often celebration had quietly become definition. I did not tell her that. Not every realization needed to be handed back to the child who caused it. High school started before Leah had made any permanent decision about gymnastics. That helped more than I expected. New teachers did not all know her athletic history. New classmates asked different questions. She had to find classrooms, remember locker combinations, learn which stairwell became unusable between bells, and decide whether sitting near the front in algebra was worth the risk of being called on more often. Her world became larger, simply because more things demanded space inside it. For the first time in years, no training schedule controlled our afternoons. That freedom did not feel entirely good. Some days, Leah came home relieved to have nothing scheduled. Other days, 5 o'clock arrived, and she paced through the house as if she had forgotten an appointment. Her body remembered practice before her mind decided whether she missed it. Brooke was still training. That became the quietest source of conflict in Leah's recovery, because there was nobody to blame for it. Brooke had done nothing wrong. She had not caused the accident. She had never pressured Leah to return. She checked in without smothering her, and learned, faster than most adults did, when to talk about gymnastics, and when to talk about anything else. She also kept living the life Leah had left. There were practices, conditioning complaints, new routines, team photos, pictures from the gym with captions. Leah sometimes showed me and sometimes did not. One afternoon I found her sitting at the kitchen island staring at a video Brooke had posted of a clean tumbling pass. Leah watched it once, let the clip replay automatically, then locked her phone. Her face had the same expression I had seen after the first few weeks of school accommodations. Something caught between longing and annoyance. I did not ask whether she was jealous. That would have forced her to choose a neat emotion. She eventually told me on her own. She wanted Brooke to do well. She also hated that Brooke still knew where she belonged every afternoon. The contradiction embarrassed her. Leah had always been hard on herself, for emotions she considered unfair. Anger needed a reason. Jealousy needed justification. If somebody had not harmed her, she assumed she had no right to resent what they had. I reminded her that wanting something somebody else still had did not make her a bad friend. That was all. She did not need a lesson on emotional complexity from her mother. She needed permission not to turn every uncomfortable feeling into a moral failure. Brooke made that easier by continuing to be Brooke. She complained about Simone's temporary replacement coaches in one message and praised one of them in the next. She told Leah which teammate had changed her floor music and which one had threatened to quit because she hated her new choreography. The gym did not freeze around Leah's absence. At first that hurt. Leah had carried a picture in her head of what would happen if she stepped away. People scrambling, teammates resentful, Simone trying to rebuild everything around the hole Leah left. Instead, lineups changed. Someone else took a spot. The next meet happened. Then another. The team did not collapse. When Brooke explained it, she did not make a speech about replaceability. She simply said teams adjusted, because that was what teams did. Leah went quiet afterward. I knew enough by then not to rush into the silence. A few minutes later, she said she had spent so much time believing everyone depended on her that finding out they could continue without her felt both terrible and good. That was the closest she came to naming the freedom. The world had not ended because she stopped. The fact should have been obvious. To Leah, it was new. Changes at Pacific Crest also began reaching us indirectly. Gwen kept her official updates limited to matters relevant to Leah or the continuing safety review. I appreciated that. She did not use me as an audience for club politics, and I did not want Leah's recovery turned into a weekly report on Simone's professional life. Brooke sometimes mentioned changes, without realizing they mattered. One younger gymnast had sat out part of a practice because her ankle hurt. Another girl had told a coach she felt dizzy before conditioning and had been pulled without argument. Nobody treated either event as heroic. That was precisely why they mattered. I did not want a second scandal. I did not want proof that Pacific Crest had always been dangerous. Reality was less satisfying and more complicated than that. A lot of things at the gym had probably been normal. A lot of athletes had probably been safe. And some habits had still taught children to hide discomfort until hiding it became part of being serious. After Leah's accident, people were more careful. The change did not undo anything. It did prove something to Leah that I thought she needed more than outrage. Speaking up did not automatically make you the person who ruined everything. Sometimes people simply adjusted. In late August, Leah's specialist approved another increase in ordinary physical activity. Nothing close to full gymnastics. Walking, light conditioning, balance work, gradual exertion as tolerated. We followed the plan exactly. I became annoyingly precise about that. I also worked hard not to make my precision contagious. When Leah moved through an exercise without symptoms, I did not celebrate as though she had passed a test. When she stopped early, I did not treat caution as an achievement that required praise. The goal was becoming less dramatic about both continuation and stopping. That was harder than it sounds. Parents are trained to respond. Child succeeds, praise. Child struggles, reassure. Child stops, encourage. Child restarts, celebrate. I was learning that sometimes the healthiest response was to let an ordinary choice remain ordinary. The idea of visiting another gym came from Leah. She brought it up one evening while we were cleaning dinner dishes. Not training, not signing up, just visiting. There was a skills-based recreational program not far from us that one of her school friends had mentioned. The coach, Alyssa Chen, worked with athletes who wanted technique and movement without the full competitive schedule. My first response happened inside my body. The water running over my hands suddenly felt too cold. I saw Leah on the spring floor. I heard Dana saying she had not cleared her. Then Leah reached past me for a towel, and the kitchen came back. Months earlier, and the fear like that would have decided the answer. This time I told her I wanted to check the program and make sure any visit fit her medical restrictions. That was not control, that was parenting. There was a difference, though sometimes I still had to repeat it to myself. Alyssa agreed that Leah could observe first and participate only later if her medical progression allowed it. The first visit happened on a Saturday morning that felt almost offensively normal. No packed competition bag. No team jacket, no score sheet, no Marilyn carrying crackers. I still brought too much water. Some habits apparently required more than one family crisis to cure. The gym itself was smaller than Pacific Crest. There were beams, bars, a spring floor, mats, chalk bins, all the objects capable of pulling memory out of Leah before she was ready for it. I watched her stop just inside the entrance. Her eyes moved across the room. For a few seconds I thought we might leave. I had promised myself I would let her choose, which meant I could not offer the exit before she asked for one, simply because I wanted to use it. Leah took another step, then another. Nothing happened. Nobody recognized her as the injured athlete from April. Nobody asked whether she planned to come back. Alyssa greeted us briefly, explained where we could sit, and went back to coaching. We watched. That was all. A recreational group moved through basic skills on the far side of the floor. Ages varied more than Leah was used to seeing in a competitive session. Some athletes were experienced, others were clearly there because being upside down sounded fun. A little girl, maybe 8, attempted a simple skill on a low mat, lost her balance, and rolled sideways in a heap. She popped up immediately. I meant to do that. The seriousness of her face made Leah laugh. Not the careful little laugh she had given Grandpa over the cookie. A real one. Her shoulders folded forward. She covered her mouth. The girl had already moved on, and had no idea she had done anything important. I looked away before Leah caught me watching. That laugh was hers. I did not want to turn it into evidence of recovery. For the next 40 minutes we watched a gym operate without anybody acting as though every correction carried consequences for a season. What struck Leah most was not the lack of intensity. Alyssa was still demanding about technique. She corrected body position. She made athletes repeat things. She stopped sloppy attempts. Nobody was wandering around doing whatever they felt like. The difference appeared when one teenage girl started a sequence, stopped midway, and told Alyssa something did not feel right in her wrist. Alyssa checked in, modified the activity, and moved her to something else. No sigh, no visible disappointment, no discussion about who would need to replace her, no praise for being smart enough to stop. Just adjustment. Leah watched until the athlete was doing another drill. On the drive home, she was quiet for almost 10 minutes. Then she said she had forgotten gymnastics could look boring. I glanced at her. She meant it as a compliment. There had been no emotional weight attached to every decision. No scoreboard humming invisibly behind the room. Nobody's identity seemed to depend on finishing a drill. We stopped for food on the way home. For once, Leah did not ask whether what she chose was good athlete food. She ordered what she wanted and ate almost all of it. I noticed. I did not comment. Over the next week, she started talking more clearly about what she missed. Not medals. Not podiums. Not hearing her score. She missed the sensation of a skill becoming reliable. She missed stretching beside people who understood why certain muscles hurt after certain days. She missed chalk. She missed the strange pleasure of being upside down and knowing exactly where the floor was even when she could not see it. She missed Brooke. She missed being good at something difficult. Those admissions mattered because, until then, I had unconsciously divided the world into two possibilities. Gymnastics had hurt Leah. Therefore, gymnastics was bad. But the sport itself had also given her years of joy. The injury had not erased that. Simone's decision had not erased it. Competitive pressure had grown around the thing Leah loved until I could no longer see where one ended and the other began. Leah could. She did not miss having every Saturday assigned months in advance. She did not miss knowing which teammate's score needed to be replaced if she faltered. She did not miss adults asking about rankings before asking whether she had enjoyed herself. That distinction gave both of us something we had not had since April. Options. By early September, our home had begun looking less like a recovery site. The medication reminders were gone from the refrigerator because they were no longer needed. School books had replaced medical handouts on the dining table. Leah complained about algebra more often than headaches. Her 15th birthday was approaching. For the first time, gymnastics was not going to be the organizing theme of the week. I was grateful for that. Then Simone asked to meet with me. The request did not come directly. Because of the ongoing club process and the boundaries I had established around Leah, the communication came through the appropriate channel rather than as an unexpected phone call. Simone wanted an adult-only conversation. She was not asking for access to Leah. She was asking to speak with me. I read the request twice. My first instinct was no. My second was also no. The third took longer. For months I had heard Simone's explanations in fragments. At the hospital, she had said Leah wanted to compete. Through the club record, she had repeated that Leah felt better. Through Mom, I had heard secondhand versions of how devastated Simone was. What I had not heard was whether she understood the distinction at the center of everything. Not whether she regretted the outcome. Whether she understood the decision. Those were not the same thing. I agreed to meet her without Leah present. Before the meeting happened, the investigator contacted me with a brief update. The case was still under review. The district attorney had not reached a charging decision yet. They were continuing to assess the documented removal, Simone's acknowledgement, Leah's return to activity, and the medical consequences. Nothing about the update promised me a particular outcome. That was fine. I no longer needed every external process to move at the speed of my anger. Simone and I met in a quiet, neutral place where neither of us had family memories attached to the furniture. She looked different. Not dramatically. She had not transformed into a broken woman designed to make me feel guilty. She simply looked like someone whose days had lost their familiar structure. Coaching had organized her life for most of adulthood. Without it, even the way she held herself seemed less certain. I had expected an apology, maybe denial, maybe a request for forgiveness. Instead, Simone sat across from me, folded her hands together, and gave me the first sentence she had clearly been waiting months to say. I need you to understand that I thought letting her stop would hurt her more. I need you to understand that I thought letting her stop would hurt her more. That was how Simone began, not with an apology, not with denial, with a theory. For months, I had imagined that if we ever sat across from each other again, I would need to fight through excuses before reaching the truth. Instead, Simone placed the truth on the table almost immediately. The problem was that she still believed part of it made sense. She told me she remembered the entire sequence from the meet with painful clarity. Dana had removed Leah after the beam fall. Simone had read the restriction. She had signed the acknowledgement. She had known I had not been personally contacted. None of those facts were disputed. Leah had rested. Leah had said the headache was easing. Leah had told Simone she wanted to compete. Simone had believed her. More than that, she had believed she understood what Leah's answer meant better than Dana did. That was the part she kept returning to. She had coached Leah for years. She knew how Leah behaved when she was frightened, frustrated, tired, embarrassed, or truly injured. She had watched hundreds of athletes become convinced they could not continue after a bad fall, a missed skill, a painful landing, or a sudden wave of nerves. Sometimes the difference between quitting and succeeding, Simone said, was an adult who knew not to let the athlete make a permanent decision inside a temporary feeling. Listening to her, I understood why she had survived so long inside her own reasoning. Nothing she said sounded like cruelty. That was what made it dangerous. She was not describing herself as someone who ignored Leah's safety. She was describing herself as someone who understood toughness. Simone had built an entire adult identity around the belief that fear and discomfort could lie to people. Sometimes they did. A tired athlete could discover she had more energy than she thought. A gymnast could freeze before a safe skill and complete it after one more attempt. Those experiences were true often enough that Simone had started treating them like universal rules. But Dana's form was not fear or hesitation. It was a medical boundary, and Simone had still believed her own judgment belonged above it. She said Leah had looked steadier before floor, had answered coherently, and had insisted she wanted to continue. Simone knew the lineup pressure existed, but maintained that Leah was not a child who could be pushed into something she truly did not want. My hands tightened beneath the table. Leah was 14, old enough to express a preference, not old enough to turn a formal medical restriction into an optional suggestion, because her coach thought she sounded confident. Eventually, Simone began talking about our childhood. She remembered Mom waking before dawn for practice, fundraisers, weekend meets, meals in parking lots, sore wrists, ice packs, and competition mornings when one of us felt sick from nerves and went anyway. Where I remembered pressure, Simone remembered proof that hard things could be survived. When I left at 15, she became the family example of grit, then carried the same lesson into college gymnastics and coaching. Pain could be normal, fear could be managed, and serious athletes learned to distinguish discomfort from danger. The problem was not that every one of those ideas was false. It was that Simone had spent decades being rewarded for endurance, and gradually mistook that history for expertise in how much other people should endure. For the first time since April, I could feel something other than anger toward her. Not forgiveness and not sympathy strong enough to excuse anything, but something closer to grief. I could see the girl she had been beneath the coach sitting across from me praised for continuing, admired for enduring, then rewarded when frightened athletes trusted her enough to try again. Leah had entered that system as a niece Simone genuinely loved, and Simone used the most dangerous version of the language she had spent her life being rewarded for speaking. The explanation made her choice more understandable. It did not make it smaller. Simone finally said what she had been circling. I was trying to make her stronger. The sentence might once have sounded noble. After everything Leah had told me, it sounded different. I thought about Dana's red form. Leah's relief at being removed. The 6 weeks of sideways questions. The hospital blanket twisting between her fingers while she wondered whether the team had lost because of her. Strength isn't something you can force into a child by taking away the safe way out. That was all I said. Simone looked down. For several seconds, neither of us filled the silence. I did not need to. The room had finally become honest enough that another argument would only weaken it. Eventually, Simone reached the part I had been waiting for. The team. Until then, she had described the incident almost entirely as a coaching decision about Leah. She had talked about resilience, fear, judgment, and experience. But people rarely make terrible decisions for one reason. I asked her whether the team score had mattered. Her face changed before she answered. Not dramatically, just enough. Yes, the season had been worse than I knew. Several parents had questioned Simone's approach. 2 families had already left Pacific Crest, and another had threatened to move their daughter if results did not improve. The April Invitational would not have solved the season, but a strong team result would have given Simone something measurable to point to, and Leah's floor score mattered to that result. There it was. Simone believed Leah could continue, and Simone needed her to continue. Those beliefs supported each other so neatly that she had never forced herself to separate them. She had not simply put winning above Leah's safety. She had convinced herself the result she needed for the program was also what Leah needed for her own growth. Simone knew by then that signing the restriction made her decision impossible to defend professionally, but part of her still wanted the underlying philosophy rescued, as if the method had been sound, and only this outcome had gone wrong. I was no longer willing to give her that. The conversation moved eventually toward the criminal investigation. Simone had an attorney by then. She had been advised not to discuss certain details publicly or contact Leah directly. She knew prosecutors were reviewing the matter, and that the club process could not protect her from whatever happened outside gymnastics. Then she asked me for something. Not to drop the case. She knew I could not. Not to lie. Something more subtle. If prosecutors asked, she wanted me to make clear that she had never intended for Leah to be harmed. I told her I had no evidence that she meant for Leah to be injured, and I would say that honestly. I would also say that she knowingly returned Leah to competition after receiving a formal medical removal. I would not exaggerate her into a monster, and I would not rescue her into a victim of misunderstanding. The facts were enough. We left without hugging. There was no reconciliation. There was also no dramatic declaration that I never wanted to see her again. The truth had become too complicated for theatrical endings. Simone had loved Leah. She had endangered Leah. Both sentences belonged in the same story. Afterward, I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. I had expected the conversation to make me feel triumphant. Instead, I felt emptied out. For months, anger had given Simone a simple shape in my mind. She was the adult who crossed the line. Now I could see the whole path that brought her there. The family praise, the years of training, the identity, the professional pressure, the need to prove herself. Seeing the path did not make me want consequences less. It made me understand why consequences mattered. Because people who believe they meant well can repeat enormous harm if the only lesson they take away is that they chose badly once. Thomas changed in a quieter way. Dad did not call me after my meeting with Simone and ask for details. He did not ask whether I thought she had apologized enough. He did not try to organize another family conversation. He simply stopped intervening. Mom noticed before I did. She complained that Dad was abandoning Simone when she needed family support most. By then, Mom had begun treating every refusal to shield Simone as another betrayal. Dad had helped Simone with some ordinary practical matters after the suspension rides, groceries, paperwork, the kinds of things parents do when an adult child suddenly loses the routine around which her life was built. But he stopped doing anything that resembled lobbying. He would not ask me to soften statements. He would not ask Leah to send a reassuring message. He would not carry Simone's explanations into my house. Mom found that unforgivable. Dad did not become cruel toward Simone. He continued speaking to her, continued caring whether she ate, slept, and functioned. He simply stopped treating love as evidence that consequences should disappear. One evening he told me, in his usual awkward way, that he had spent too much time confusing keeping the family together with keeping the family comfortable. Then he changed the subject and asked whether Leah needed help assembling a desk. That was Dad. Growth wrapped in hardware. Leah turned 15 in September. I had worried in advance that her birthday would become another symbol whether she wanted it to or not. First birthday after the accident. First birthday after Simone's suspension. First birthday in a family that could no longer gather in the same room without someone carrying history into it. Leah solved the problem by refusing to make the day meaningful. She wanted pizza, 2 school friends, Brooke, a movie, and a cake that had nothing to do with gymnastics. No theme decorations, no inspirational message, no stronger than ever. I bought the cake. Dad dropped off a gift earlier in the day and left without assuming he had been invited to the evening. Mom sent a card. I gave it to Leah without commentary because it was addressed to her and contained no message from Simone. Brooke arrived wearing a ridiculous paper birthday crown she had apparently stolen from a restaurant months earlier and saved for no good reason. Leah wore it through half the movie, before claiming the elastic was trying to cut off circulation to her brain. The house filled with the kind of noise I had missed. Teenagers talking over one another, someone dropping pizza on a napkin, and pretending that had been intentional. Leah laughing hard enough to forget that laughter had once triggered headaches. For 3 hours, nobody said the word gymnastics. The absence felt almost sacred. At one point, I stood in the kitchen cutting cake, while Leah argued with Brooke about the movie they had chosen. I watched my daughter roll her eyes, reach for another slice, and complain about a character making an obviously stupid decision. That was all. No lesson, no metaphor. 15 did not need to mark survival. It could simply be a birthday. A few weeks later, the call came from the investigator. By then, October had cooled the evenings just enough that I had started leaving the kitchen window cracked while making dinner. Leah was upstairs working on a history project. A pan was heating on the stove when my phone vibrated. I almost let it go to voicemail. The investigation had been moving slowly enough that I had stopped assuming every call meant something decisive. This one did. The investigator explained that the district attorney's office had completed its initial review of the available evidence, Dana's removal documentation, the signed acknowledgement, the event timeline, medical findings, statements, the fact that Leah returned to competition after being formally removed. They had decided the evidence supported filing a child endangerment charge. I turned off the burner. That was the only movement I remember making. There was no rush of victory, no relief large enough to erase what happened, just the click of the stove knob and the sudden awareness that the family had spent 6 months arguing about whether Simone's decision deserved consequences. Now that argument no longer belonged to us. The case was moving forward, and for the first time since the hospital, whether Simone was held accountable no longer depended on whether my mother could convince me to keep what happened inside the family. By November, the criminal case had become something that existed in calendars, attorney schedules, and occasional phone calls, rather than something that entered our kitchen every day. That distance helped. For months, I had measured time by what Simone's decision was doing next. The hospital, the police report, the club review, the investigator, the district attorney, the charge. Every stage had pulled the same afternoon back into the center of our lives. Leah had started doing something different. She was building days that did not need April to explain them. High school helped. So did 15. She had homework she hated, friends who irritated her in ordinary ways, and a growing collection of interests that had nothing to do with whether her body could rotate through the air. Some afternoons she came home talking about a class project before she remembered to ask whether I had heard anything about the case. I learned not to volunteer updates, simply because I had them. The adults had already made too much of Leah's life about things she had not chosen. Still, some consequences could not remain invisible. Pacific Crest completed its internal safety review in November. Gwen called me before the formal notice circulated to the families most directly affected. She kept the conversation short. The review had concluded that Simone received and acknowledged Leah's removal, failed to notify me, failed to scratch Leah from the lineup, and permitted her return to athletic participation in violation of the medical restriction. The club terminated Simone's position as head coach. The sports disciplinary process also continued separately. USA Gymnastics Safety and Response maintained restrictions that kept her away from sanctioned athlete contact while the matter proceeded. There was no dramatic press conference. No parents gathering in a parking lot to condemn her. No viral post. The consequences were quieter than that. A name that had once been printed beside coaching assignments disappeared from schedules. Through the limited club updates Gwen shared, I learned that parents who had once requested Simone for private sessions were now asking who would take over their daughter's training. The office, where she had spent years planning lineups, schedules, and routines, was no longer hers. The authority vanished before the arguments did. That was the part Mom could not accept. She called me the day after Simone's termination became official. I almost did not answer. For weeks, our conversations had been brief and structured. If she asked about Leah, I responded. If she drifted toward Simone, I ended the call. It was not punishment. It was the only boundary I had found that prevented every conversation from becoming another trial inside the family. That day, Mom did not even pretend the call was about Leah. She said I had gotten what I wanted. The words were not shouted. That made them worse. I stood beside the laundry room counter with one of Leah's school sweatshirts half folded beneath my hands and listened while Mom described the pieces of Simone's life disappearing. The job, the athletes, the reputation, the possibility that she might never coach the same way again. Mom kept using passive language. It was being taken from Simone. Her career was being destroyed. Her name was being ruined. I had heard that language before. At 15, when I wanted to leave gymnastics, the years already spent had become something I was supposedly throwing away. Now the years Simone had spent coaching had become something other people were supposedly taking from her. Mom could not stop treating investment as ownership. I let her finish. Then I gave her the only chain of facts that mattered. Dana removed Leah. Simone signed the acknowledgement. Simone returned her. The club reviewed what happened. The governing body reviewed what happened. The district attorney reviewed what happened. None of those people worked for me. I had not fired Simone. I had not suspended her. I had not filed charges myself. I had told the truth and stopped interfering with what the truth caused. Mom did not accept the distinction. She said there were things families did for each other when one person made a catastrophic mistake. I looked at the sweatshirt in my hands. There were things families did for each other. That was true. We brought food. We sat in hospitals. We drove people to appointments. We answered calls at bad hours. We stayed near someone who was ashamed. What we did not owe each other was immunity. I did not say all of that out loud. The conversation did not need a speech. I simply told Mom I had not asked for Simone's career. I had asked the adults responsible for children to take seriously what happened to mine. Then I ended the call before she could hand the consequence back to me again. For the rest of the afternoon, the sweatshirt stayed unfolded. Months earlier, Mom's accusations would have filled the whole day. I would have replayed them, defended myself to an empty room, imagined better answers. That time, I went back to the laundry. The difference was small. It felt enormous. Leah's medical progress moved more quietly than Simone's professional downfall. By late November, she had been symptom-free during normal school days for long enough that her medical team began progressing her through more demanding physical activity. The return was staged and deliberately unexciting. Walking became longer sessions. Light conditioning became controlled exertion. Balance exercises came back. Everything advanced only when the previous stage did not trigger symptoms. There was no moment when a doctor dramatically announced that she was cured. Recovery was a sequence of ordinary days that stopped punishing her for doing ordinary things. Leah treated the progression with more patience than I expected, maybe because this time stopping had no moral meaning attached to it. If an exercise caused symptoms, the plan changed. Nobody called it weakness. Nobody asked which teammate would be inconvenienced. Nobody reminded her what she had already invested. The rule was mechanical. Your body gives information. You respond. For most of my life, I had assumed discipline meant overriding discomfort. Now I watched Leah develop another kind of discipline: attention. By December, her medical team agreed she could begin carefully supervised, low-pressure gymnastics activity as part of a graduated return, provided everything remained within the prescribed limits. I read the instructions more times than necessary. Then I read them again. The first session at Alyssa's gym was scheduled for a Saturday morning. The night before, I packed nothing. That was deliberate. Leah already had what she needed: water, comfortable training clothes, her own small bag. I told myself there was no reason for me to add backup snacks, extra tape, 2 spare water bottles, emergency hair supplies, and a pharmacy disguised as maternal concern. At 7 the next morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen with an electrolyte packet in one hand. I put it back. Progress was not always dignified. The drive felt longer than it was. Leah controlled the music. She talked about school, then fell quiet as we got closer to the gym. I did not ask whether she was nervous. The question would have forced her to inspect herself for an emotion she was already carrying well enough. When we pulled into the parking lot, she stayed in the passenger seat for a few seconds after I turned off the engine. Then she opened the door. I followed. The smell hit me first. Chalk, rubber mats, a faint mix of sweat, cleaning solution, and the dry mineral dust that managed to settle on everything inside a gymnastics facility. My body remembered before I wanted it to. The spring floor, Leah motionless, the ambulance. For 1 second, I had the irrational urge to turn around and put her back in the car. Leah had not noticed. That saved me. Fear had belonged to too many adults already. I kept mine. Alyssa met Leah near the edge of the training area and reviewed the limits that had been provided. No high-risk tumbling. No pressure to complete anything. Basic movement, flexibility, balance, and low-level skills within the medical progression. The entire explanation lasted a few minutes. Nobody needed 20 lines of dialogue to make safety real. The important thing was what happened afterward. Alyssa stopped talking about the injury. Leah joined the session. I sat in the parent area. That simple separation felt like an exam I had not studied for. At Pacific Crest, I had spent years watching Leah through the lens of performance. Form, landings, scores, whether she looked confident. Now I had to stop myself from watching her for signs of catastrophe. She stretched. Nothing happened. She moved through basic conditioning. Nothing happened. She walked across a low beam. Nothing happened. The first 15 minutes were so ordinary that I almost resented them. My nervous system had prepared for danger. The gym gave me repetition instead. Leah began loosening into herself. Her movements were smaller than they had once been, but the familiarity was visible. She did not look like a patient borrowing an athlete's body. She looked like Leah. Then Alyssa moved her toward a basic tumbling sequence. Nothing dangerous. Nothing close to the pass that had ended the April meet. Still, I felt my hands close around each other. Leah set her feet. Started. Stopped. For a moment, the room narrowed again. I could not tell whether she had felt pain, dizziness, or fear. My first impulse was to stand. I stayed seated. Alyssa approached without urgency. She asked Leah something I could not hear. Leah answered. They stood there for a few seconds. No one looked at me. That mattered. Alyssa was treating Leah as the person whose body had produced the information. Not me. Not the coach. Leah tried a modified version of the movement. She completed it. Then she stood still. Her face had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to recognize the same inward attention I had seen during recovery, when she was deciding whether a headache was starting. Alyssa checked in again. This time I could hear the end of the exchange, because the music on the other side of the gym had stopped. She gave Leah options. Modify. Rest. Stop for the day. Leah looked toward the floor, then toward me. I did not nod. I did not smile. I did not give her a signal. Months ago, she would have searched my face for the acceptable answer. I wanted no part in creating one. Leah turned back to Alyssa. I'm done for today. That was all. Alyssa accepted it. No persuasion, no question asked twice. No reminder that Leah had only been there 20 minutes. No discussion about how much work it had taken to reach that point. She simply redirected her toward cooling down. The session continued around them. A younger gymnast laughed after falling onto a mat. Someone adjusted music. A coach corrected a hand position. Nothing in the room treated Leah's stopping as an event. I had spent most of the year thinking the most important moment of her recovery would be watching her return. I had been wrong. It was watching the world continue after she stopped. Leah held herself together until we reached the parking lot. Then she sat in the passenger seat without closing the door. Her breathing changed. I waited beside the car. Tears came before she seemed to understand why. She was not hurt. Her head did not ache. Nothing medically alarming had happened. She simply started crying. I sat in the driver's seat and closed my own door, leaving hers open until she was ready. Eventually, Leah wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt and said it had felt weird, not scary exactly. Wrong. She had kept expecting Alyssa to ask whether she was sure. The question never came. She had expected disappointment. There was none. She had expected the other girls to notice. Most of them had not. Stopping had taken less than 10 seconds. The consequences Leah had spent years imagining did not arrive. No team lost points. No adult's career shifted. Nobody looked at her differently. She had said no. The room had allowed the word to remain complete. I wanted to tell her how proud I was. The sentence rose all the way into my mouth before I stopped it. For years, praise had been one of the ways adults told Leah which behavior they wanted repeated. Good score, good effort, good toughness, good commitment. Now I was about to turn, stopping into another performance. Be brave enough to stop and Mom will be proud. Same structure, different approved answer. So I did not tell her she had done the right thing. I asked whether she wanted food or quiet. Leah looked at me through wet eyelashes. Food. That answer made both of us laugh a little. We drove to a taco place she liked. No debrief, no lesson, no family philosophy. We ate. That afternoon, Brooke sent Leah a message, asking how the session had gone. Leah told her she had stopped early. Brooke's response made Leah laugh hard enough to bring the phone over and show me. Apparently, Leah had used enough chalk during 20 minutes of low-level activity to leave white dust across the back seat. Brooke informed her that this meant she was officially a gymnast again because the car would never be clean. I looked over my shoulder. There was, in fact, chalk on the seat. Not much. Enough. For months, anything left over from gymnastics had felt contaminated by memory. The competition bag, the medals, old schedules. Even chalk had become attached to the floor where Leah collapsed. Now there was a white handprint on my upholstery, and my daughter was laughing at it. I left it there for 3 days. Not for symbolism, because I forgot to clean it. That felt even better. Leah returned the following week. Then again, progress was not linear. One day she stayed longer. Another day she stopped after a basic sequence because she felt mentally tired. Alyssa treated both decisions with equal neutrality. That changed something in Leah faster than any lecture could have. She stopped announcing every physical sensation like a defense case. She did not need to prove why she was stopping because no one demanded a threshold of suffering high enough to justify it. That freedom also made continuing more meaningful. If leaving was available, staying became an actual choice. I learned the same lesson from the parent area. Every session forced me to practice sitting with uncertainty. Sometimes Leah landed awkwardly. My body still reacted. Sometimes another gymnast fell, and the sound sent April through me before I could stop it. I learned to feel the fear without treating it as instruction. There were days I drove home more exhausted than Leah. I never told her that. She had enough work without carrying mine. The criminal case stayed in the background through December. Attorneys handled what attorneys handled. The next major steps would not happen until after the holidays. I answered factual questions when asked, and stopped checking for updates every few days. Simone's professional situation remained restricted. Mom continued blaming me from a safer distance. Dad did not. He sent Leah a ridiculous set of desk organizers for school and asked permission before visiting. The first time he came over after Leah returned to the gym, he did not ask whether she had done a routine. He asked whether she had liked being there. Leah noticed. So did I. Near the end of December, Leah and I were driving home from one of her sessions. The streets were crowded with holiday traffic, and somebody 2 cars ahead of us had tied an inflatable snowman to the roof, badly enough that it leaned backward every time the vehicle accelerated. Leah watched it for several blocks. Then she said she thought she wanted to keep gymnastics. My hands tightened on the steering wheel for half a second. Old fear. Still there. I kept my eyes on the road. Leah must have noticed the silence, because she continued before I could say anything. I just don't think I want to compete anymore. And for the first time, I heard those words not as something my daughter was giving up, but as the beginning of something she was finally choosing. By January, I had stopped expecting justice to feel dramatic. For months, the criminal case had existed in pauses. A call returned 3 days later. A hearing date moved. An attorney needed another week. A document traveled from one office to another while Leah went to school, complained about homework, and came home with chalk on the sleeve of a sweatshirt she no longer treated like evidence of anything. That was probably healthier than the version of justice I had imagined in the hospital. Back then, anger had wanted immediacy. I wanted Simone's signature to produce a consequence as quickly as Leah's body had produced one. I wanted the red words on Dana's form to mean something before anyone had time to soften them. I wanted every adult who had asked me to wait to understand that waiting was exactly what had failed my daughter in the first place. But criminal cases did not move at the speed of a mother's fear. By the time Simone's case approached resolution, Leah had already changed more than the legal process had. She was attending the recreational gym regularly. She had no interest in returning to competitive training. She was doing more at school. She had learned that saying no during a session did not require a medical crisis first. Those things mattered to me more than any courthouse date. Still, the date came. Simone's attorney and the prosecutor had reached a negotiated resolution. I learned most of the details through formal channels, and the result meant Leah would not face months preparing for the possibility of testifying through a fully contested trial. Simone entered a no-contest plea to misdemeanor child endangerment. The words looked almost too small on paper. They could not contain the sound of Leah hitting the floor or waking in a hospital worried about her team. But the legal system was not being asked to carry every emotional consequence. It was being asked to name the conduct. The court placed Simone on 48 months of probation, imposed a criminal protective order centered on Leah's safety, and required at least a year of approved child safety treatment counseling, along with fines, and ordinary compliance conditions. There was no dramatic prison sentence or courtroom spectacle. The important part was that the decision was no longer being described only as coaching judgment. It had a legal consequence. The professional consequences settled into place beside the criminal ones. Pacific Crest had already terminated Simone months earlier, and the sport's disciplinary restrictions prevented her from simply moving to another sanctioned gym and rebuilding the same authority under a different logo. Trust had been the foundation of her career, and the qualities parents once admired in her knowing when to push, getting frightened athletes past a block, now had to be weighed against the judgment that had endangered Leah. Mom still could not accept that. 2 days after the plea, she called and said one afternoon had destroyed Simone's future. I was cutting an apple when she said it, and the phrase made me stop. One afternoon was still how Mom told the story, as though a bad day had fallen on Simone, instead of a decision being examined for months by people outside our family. Mom asked whether the outcome satisfied me. I looked across the kitchen at Leah's abandoned backpack, a history textbook sticking out of the top and chalk dust along one corner from the gym bag she had dropped beside it the night before. That ordinary mess was closer to what I wanted than punishment ever had been. I told Mom Leah being safe was the point. She reminded me that Simone had already lost her job, reputation, and place in the sport. I understood why the accumulated consequences felt excessive to her, but the club, governing organization, prosecutor, and court had each been answering a different part of the same conduct. I had not asked any of them to protect Simone from what their own reviews found. Mom told me she still loved Leah. I believed her. Love could be genuine and still fail to cancel denial or create a right to access, so her contact with Leah remained limited until she could stop turning the child's recovery into a bridge back to Simone's pain. Thomas handled the plea differently. He came by that weekend to help Leah adjust the height on the desk he had assembled months earlier. She had grown enough that the chair position bothered her now, which Dad treated as a mechanical problem worthy of serious attention. He arrived with a measuring tape and no legal opinions. That alone told me something. Later, while Leah was upstairs, he stood in the kitchen and said he had spoken to Mom. He did not ask me to forgive her. He did not ask me to change the boundary. He simply told me he would not participate in any attempt to persuade Leah to visit Simone, write to her, reassure her, or tell her she was forgiven before she was ready. Dad had spent months arriving at that sentence. He said he should have understood earlier that keeping the peace was not the same thing as keeping a family healthy. Then he looked down at the measuring tape, still hooked to his belt, and added that he had spent a long time treating every conflict like a wall crack that could be patched before anyone inspected the foundation. It was the sort of metaphor Dad would actually use. I did not need anything more polished. He apologized for helping turn Simone's protection into a family duty. The apology did not erase the hospital. It did not erase. She needed this. It did something smaller. It stopped asking me to pretend those things had never happened. When Leah came downstairs, Dad did not tell her we had talked. He asked whether the desk felt better. She sat in the chair, tested the height, and told him it was fine. Then she added that he had made one drawer stick. Dad looked offended enough that Leah laughed. That was how repair had started to look in our family. Not speeches, not declarations. A drawer. A cookie. A visit where nobody demanded emotional payment for showing up. Simone contacted me one final time that month, through the appropriate channel. The legal resolution had imposed boundaries around contact with Leah, and I had no intention of testing them. Simone did not ask me to. Her request was adult to adult. She wanted me to tell Leah one thing, that she had believed in her. The sentence irritated me before I had even decided why. For years, believing in Leah had sounded like praise. Now, it carried too much weight. Simone had believed Leah could endure, believed Leah could push through, believed Leah could rescue a team result, believed Leah could become stronger if somebody did not let her stop too easily. Belief had become another way adults told Leah who she was supposed to be. I did not deliver the message. I told Simone that if Leah ever chose contact in the future, within whatever legal and safety boundaries existed then, she could decide what she wanted to hear and what she wanted to say. I would not carry another adult's emotional burden into my daughter's life and ask Leah to interpret it correctly. Simone did not argue. That surprised me more than an argument would have. For once, she allowed the boundary to remain complete. The conversation ended there. I did not know whether Simone cried afterward, whether she was angry, or whether she understood why I refused. Those thoughts no longer belonged to me. For most of the year, I had spent too much energy imagining everyone else's inner life. By then, knowing what Simone had done, what she had admitted, and what consequences followed was enough. A few weeks after the plea, I noticed I had stopped checking for updates about her. The case no longer controlled my mornings. Simone was on probation. The professional restrictions remained, and nothing I did from my kitchen would improve or worsen those facts. People had called what I was doing revenge, and there had been nights when anger made me wonder whether they were right. But anger was not the same as action. I had reported what happened, preserved what I received, answered questions, and refused to soften facts. Then I let systems outside me decide what those facts meant. I had stopped standing between Simone and consequence. Leah seemed almost uninterested in that distinction. That was probably healthy. The criminal resolution mattered to her, but not in the way adults expected. She wanted to know whether Simone would be able to coach children again immediately. She wanted to know whether anyone could force her to speak to Simone. Once she understood the answers, she moved on. The legal terminology meant less to her than Tuesday's algebra quiz. I admired that. Children can sometimes leave an adult conflict more efficiently than adults do once someone finally gives them permission. At the recreational gym, Leah continued building the version of gymnastics she wanted. No scores, no meet calendar, no family standing beside a ranking board. She trained because she liked going. Sometimes, she stayed for the entire session. Sometimes she modified something. Once, she stopped early because she had barely slept the night before and her body felt slow. Nobody required a medical reason. That was the part that still amazed her. By the end of January, the phrase, "not today," had become less dramatic. The first time she used it, she had cried in the parking lot. Now she could say it and start gathering her things. That was progress I would never have known to measure a year earlier. Then, Alyssa announced a small skills showcase. Not a meet, no rankings, no medals, just athletes demonstrating what they had been working on for parents and friends. When Leah told me about it, she made sure I understood the distinction before I had time to react. Participation was optional. She could perform one skill sequence or several. She could also change her mind. I kept my face neutral and asked what she wanted. Leah said she thought she wanted to participate. The sentence carried a softness that would once have frightened me. I think, maybe, not certainty. For years, I had treated uncertainty as a problem waiting for an answer. Now it sounded like freedom. The showcase was scheduled for February. A few days before it, Leah came home from the gym, dropped her bag near the entryway, and found me sorting mail at the table. She told me she had decided she was going. Then she paused, not because she was asking permission, because she wanted to make something clear. If I wake up that morning and don't want to go, I'm not going. There were a dozen answers the old version of me might have given. You committed. People are expecting you. At least show up. See how you feel once you get there. Finish what you start. Those sentences did not arrive as words anymore. They arrived as echoes. I looked at my daughter. She was 15 now. Her hair was loose from practice. Chalk marked the side of one hand. She was waiting, not for approval exactly, but to see whether the freedom I had promised would survive contact with inconvenience. I understood that this was the test, not hers, mine. Okay, and this time, I meant it. By February, our house no longer looked like a place where something terrible had happened. That mattered more than I expected. For months after the accident, recovery had left traces everywhere. Appointment cards near the refrigerator, medication reminders, school accommodation forms, notes about screen limits, and symptom changes. Gymnastics schedules I had stopped looking at, but not yet thrown away. Even when Leah was upstairs laughing with friends, the house had carried the visual grammar of injury. By winter, most of it was gone. Her backpack had reclaimed the dining chair, shoes collected near the door again. A half-finished history assignment lived on the kitchen table beside a mug she was always forgetting to take upstairs. There were hair ties around the bathroom sink and chalk fingerprints on one of the car doors because Leah had apparently decided wiping her hands before touching things was optional now that gymnastics no longer came with a score. Ordinary mess had returned. I had never appreciated it before. Leah's week had changed too. Gymnastics was still there, but it no longer owned the calendar. She trained a few times a week because she wanted to. She had joined a school club almost by accident after Brooke convinced her to attend one meeting, then stayed because she liked the people. Some Friday nights she went out with friends. On Saturdays, there were mornings when nothing happened before noon. The first time I realized I had gone an entire week without asking how training went, I felt a brief flash of guilt. Then I understood that was the point. If something mattered to Leah, she told me. If she wanted help, she asked. Her life did not need to be inspected in order to be supported. Simone remained part of our family history, without being part of our daily routine. Her probation and professional restrictions continued. Mom's contact with Leah stayed limited, though she had become somewhat better at asking about school or friends without steering every conversation towards Simone. Dad had made more progress. He asked before visiting, stopped fishing for information, and let ordinary time with Leah stay ordinary. None of that erased what happened, but it meant the family no longer had to reopen the same argument every week. The showcase was scheduled for the second Saturday in February. For most of the week, Leah barely mentioned it. That made me more aware of it than if she had talked constantly. Old habits are patient. They wait for an opening. By Friday night, I caught myself checking the weather, even though the showcase was indoors. Then I looked up the drive time despite knowing exactly where Alyssa's gym was. Then I opened the kitchen cabinet and mentally inventoried snacks. I went to bed annoyed with myself. The next morning, I woke before Leah. For several seconds, I lay still and listened to the house. No alarm from her room yet. No footsteps. No shower. The old version of me would have gone upstairs after 5 minutes to make sure she was awake, because we had a schedule and people were expecting us, and lateness created stress. Instead, I made coffee. Then I waited. Leah came downstairs 20 minutes later wearing leggings, a loose sweatshirt, and the expression of a teenager who had not yet decided whether morning was personally offensive. She looked at the clock, then at me. I did not remind her what time we needed to leave. I asked only one thing. What do you want to do? Leah stood there for a moment. No immediate answer. That was new. There had been years when hesitation itself would have triggered encouragement from every adult around her. Come on, you'll feel better once you start. You work too hard to miss it. Don't overthink. That morning, nobody filled the silence. Leah stretched one shoulder, thought about it, and said she wanted to go. The answer mattered because staying home had been available. Not theoretically. Actually, I nodded and reached for my coffee. Then ruined the dignity of the moment by noticing the bag I had placed near the kitchen island. Leah noticed it too. I had packed water, a backup water bottle, 2 snacks, an extra sweatshirt, hair ties, a small first aid pouch, tissues, electrolyte packets, and, somehow, 3 protein bars when Leah had eaten breakfast less than 20 minutes earlier. She stared at the bag, then at me. Are we going to a 1-hour showcase? Or evacuating California? I looked down. It was ridiculous. For one second, I considered defending myself. Preparedness was useful. Snacks did not hurt anybody. A backup sweatshirt was reasonable. Then I started laughing. Leah did too. I removed half the bag. The extra water stayed home. So did 2 protein bars, the first aid pouch, and enough emergency hair supplies to survive a natural disaster. When we left, the bag was light enough that Leah carried it. That felt appropriate. The drive was easy. No competition traffic, no team buses, no coaches calling to check arrival times. Leah controlled the playlist and changed songs twice because she claimed I was making the morning too emotionally cinematic. I did not tell her she was right. The gym looked almost exactly as it had the first day we visited. That surprised me. Some part of me had expected the final version of this place to look symbolic, brighter, calmer, different. Instead, chalk dust still floated under the lights. Mats still showed scuff marks. A younger child still ran where she had been told not to run and was redirected without catastrophe. The room had not transformed. We had. Parents sat along one side of the gym. The showcase was deliberately small. No judges. No ranking board. No medals arranged on a table waiting to turn movement into placement. Athletes would demonstrate whatever they had been working on. Some had simple sequences. Some had more difficult skills. A few were clearly there because their families wanted to watch them do something they enjoyed. That was enough. Leah left her bag beside me and went to warm up. I felt the fear immediately. Not panic, something quieter. A tightening around my ribs when she stepped onto the floor. The same body that had learned to associate certain sounds with danger had not forgotten simply because 10 months had passed. Another gymnast landed a tumbling skill badly on a nearby mat. The impact snapped through me. My hand closed around the edge of the bench. The girl got up. Her coach adjusted something. The room continued. I loosened my grip. That had become my practice. Not eliminating fear, refusing to make it instructional. Leah moved through warm-up without difficulty. She stretched, did basic conditioning, laughed at something another girl said, then took her turn in a sequence she had been practicing for weeks. Her movements were not the routines she had once performed at meets. There was no need for them to be. A lower pressure program had changed not just what she trained, but why. She repeated skills because they interested her. She abandoned combinations she did not enjoy. She learned new things without asking whether they would score well. Watching that still required adjustment from me. For years, I had understood gymnastics through progression. What level? What score? What next? Now the answer could simply be, this is fun. That should have been easier. It took me months. The showcase began without ceremony. Parents clapped. Athletes went one at a time or in small groups. Leah was somewhere in the middle. Before her turn, she looked relaxed enough that I nearly believed the difficult part of the morning had passed. Then she moved toward a familiar apparatus. Her body changed. Nobody else would have noticed. I did. A pause. A slight shift of weight. The hand she normally kept loose at her side closed once, then opened. She had felt something. Maybe a physical sensation. Maybe memory. Maybe fear. From where I sat, I could not know. That uncertainty was the entire point. 10 months earlier, I would have stood. After the accident, I would have crossed the room if anyone tried to stop me. In June, I would have used the fact that I did not know as evidence that she should leave. Now I stayed seated. My pulse climbed anyway. Alyssa noticed Leah's hesitation and came over. The exchange was brief. I could not hear the first words. I did not need to. Alyssa had spent months proving what happened when an athlete expressed uncertainty. She did not negotiate the feeling away. She did not translate fear into weakness. She did not ask what everyone else needed. Leah looked at the apparatus, then toward the floor. For one moment, she glanced in my direction. My entire body wanted to answer. A nod, a shake of the head, anything. I kept my face still, not cold, available, but not directive. Leah looked away from me. That was the moment I knew something had changed for real. She did not need my expression to discover the acceptable choice. Alyssa waited. Leah took another second. Then she said it. Not today. Alyssa nodded and redirected her toward a different activity. I had imagined that moment for months without realizing it, but the part that mattered was not the refusal itself. It was what came after. Almost nothing. The showcase kept moving. Another parent clapped. Music started across the room. A coach shifted a mat. Nobody negotiated with Leah, asked her to justify the choice, or treated it as a disappointment. She joined another sequence instead, something easier that she wanted to do, and when her group finished, the applause was no different from anyone else's. Leah came back to the bench flushed and breathing harder than when she left. I wanted to stand and hug her. I wanted to tell her how proud I was. I wanted to tell her I had seen what she did and understood everything it meant. Those impulses were not wrong. But I remembered the parking lot in December. The way I had almost turned stopping into another performance adults could reward. So I handed her the water bottle. She drank. Then she asked if I had brought the protein bar she liked. I pointed at the bag. 1 bar. Not 3. She looked impressed. Growth! That made me laugh. The showcase continued for another 20 minutes. Leah stayed beside me long enough to cheer for the younger gymnast who had once fallen onto a mat and announced that she meant to do it, then joined the others when they gathered their things. There was no award ceremony, podium, or ranking. Alyssa thanked everyone for coming, and people went home. I had spent much of my life expecting important moments to announce themselves. This one looked like a teenager drinking water on a bench and deciding what she would do next. Outside, Leah asked if we could get food. At the restaurant, she ordered what she wanted, and halfway through the meal, she started complaining about a school project, a teacher she liked, a group member who never answered messages, and slides due the following week. 10 months earlier, she had woken in a hospital worried that a team had lost because of her. Now she was irritated because a boy in history had not done his share. The normality almost hurt. On the drive home, I thought about Mom, about Simone, about myself. 3 generations of women had passed down versions of the same idea. Mom treated sacrifice as proof of seriousness. Simone turned endurance into authority, and I softened the rule and called it commitment. The year had not taught me that perseverance was bad. Some promises were worth keeping, and some difficult things deserved another try. What changed was my belief that continuing automatically held the moral high ground. Stopping could be fear, wisdom, temporary, permanent, or something a person had not yet figured out. Leah was looking out the passenger window when she changed the subject again. Something about a friend's birthday plans. I remembered the party she had missed the year before, the optional Sunday practice. My answer: check with Simone. I almost told Leah I was sorry again. Instead, I asked what time the party was. She told me. Then she went back to choosing music. We drove the rest of the way home with the windows cracked slightly despite the cool air. When we pulled into the driveway, Leah grabbed the lighter gym bag from the back seat. She left the water bottle in the car. Some things, apparently, were still my responsibility. She was halfway to the door when she turned and asked whether I was coming. I got out. No medal hung around her neck, and no score followed us home. The people who had failed her were living with consequences that belonged to them now. Simone with the law and the loss of coaching authority. Mom with boundaries she could not argue away. Dad with the slow work of earning trust. My work was quieter. I had to keep fear from turning love back into control. Leah unlocked the front door. Before going inside, she looked at the chalk on her hand and wiped it against the side of her sweatshirt. 10 months earlier, I would have told her not to. That day, I let the mark stay. She disappeared into the house talking about her history project. I followed her. For the first time in our family, stopping wasn't failure. It was a choice, and it belonged to her.